Hey guys, tonight we set sail into a world of creaking timbers, salt-heavy air, and an endless horizon that never seems to change. A world where the day begins not with comfort, but with the steady rocking of a wooden ship and the faint cry of gulls overhead. The subject is the daily life of a pirate at sea, not the swashbuckling legends of films and stories, but the slow, grinding, shadowed rhythm of real men who lived their days and nights upon fragile decks, caught between hunger, storms, and the faint hope of fortune. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the bell so you'll never miss these long, quiet journeys through history. And if you enjoy these slow explorations, a simple like on the video helps the channel drift a little further across the great sea of the algorithm. I'd also love to know where you're listening from. Share your time zone or location in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how many corners of the world join together here each night. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and allow yourself to imagine the soft roll of the sea beneath you. Tonight, we step carefully onto the deck, feeling the rough wood beneath our feet, and begin at the only place such a story can begin, at the break of dawn, when another day at sea slowly and quietly begins. The first light of dawn upon the open sea arrived, not in a sudden burst of brilliance, but in a slow and steady creeping of pale color across the horizon. For men who had spent weeks, even months aboard a wooden vessel far from land, the difference between night and day was not marked by silence and activity, but by subtle changes in sound, smell, and motion. The timbers of the ship creaked with a slightly different rhythm as the air cooled in the night gave way to the faint warmth of the morning. Those who had kept the night watch stirred with relief, knowing that their long, weary vigil under starlight was nearly over, while those who had slept fitfully in hammocks or on hard planks shifted in the dim light, bracing themselves for the endless labor of another day. Life aboard a pirate ship did not begin with comfort or leisure. There was no gentle routine, no warm bed or soft call to rise. Instead, men woke to the rocking of the sea beneath them, the smell of tar, salt, and unwashed bodies mingling in the confined space below deck. The hammocks swayed with the swell of the waves, brushing against each other in the cramped dark, and rats scurried in the shadows, as much a part of the ship as the crew themselves. A pirate rose not because he had rested enough, but because the bell above deck tolled or the boatswain's call summoned all hands to duty. The ship did not wait for the comfort of men, and so the men learned to mold their lives around the unyielding rhythm of the sea. When they emerged onto the deck, the day revealed itself in muted tones. The horizon was endless, a wide sweep of water in every direction, broken only by the rising light. The sails, often patched and weathered from months of use, caught the faint morning breeze, pulling the vessel forward across the swells. The air was heavy with salt, and each breath carried the tang of the sea into their lungs, a taste so constant it became the very flavor of life itself. Above, gulls circled in lazy arcs if the ship was near land or an island, but in the deep ocean, there was little sound but the flap of canvas and the crash of water against the bow. The awakening at dawn was not the same for every man. The hierarchy aboard the ship meant that officers, quartermasters, and captains had somewhat more freedom in their waking, while common sailors and gunners were driven by the strict schedule of the bells. Yet, in pirate crews, unlike in the rigid navies of the age, there was a degree of shared hardship. The captain was not a distant figurehead, but often just another man among them, chosen for his skill or courage, and just as subject to the long days and restless nights of the sea. For all the legends of plunder and treasure, the reality was that much of a pirate's life was routine, shaped not by the thrill of battle, but by the unending repetition of shipboard chores and the monotony of survival. The first tasks of the morning began with the inspection of the ship itself. At dawn, the boatswain and his mates would walk the deck, checking rigging, sails, and lines. Ropes were tightened, knots checked, and patches adjusted. The masts loomed overhead, like great wooden pillars, each one holding the weight of canvas that propelled the ship forward. The pirates who had drawn duty in the rigging clambered up the ratlines with practiced ease, their bare feet gripping the rope as they moved to furl or unfurl sails depending on the wind. Below, others scrubbed the deck with seawater, removing the grime and waste of the previous day. These tasks were repetitive and thankless, but necessary, for a ship at sea was a fragile thing, always on the edge of breaking apart under the strain of wind and water. The sound of labor filled the air, wooden buckets clattered, ropes slapped against the deck, and the steady scrape of brushes marked the cleaning of the planks. The smell of brine and tar was joined by the faint scent of smoke as the galley cook began to stir below, preparing the meager morning meal. There was no luxury in pirate food. Most days began with hardtack, a dry biscuit that cracked rather than broke, infested often with weevils but eaten nonetheless. It was washed down with water that had long since gone stale in its barrels, or with a ration of watered rum known as grog, which dulled the taste of rot and lifted the spirits slightly. For those with coins or luck, there might be salted meat or dried peas, but often the morning fare was little more than a gesture of sustenance, enough to fuel the body for the day's work. The men ate standing, sitting on coils of rope or squatting against the rails, their eyes half closed in the weak morning light. Conversation was minimal, for there was little energy to waste on words at this early hour, and much of the routine had been repeated countless times. Yet, even in this monotony, there was comfort. The day began as it always had and always would, and in the endless sea of uncertainty, the reliability of dawn and its duties was a kind of anchor. Beyond the daily rituals, there was also a deeper sense of watchfulness. At dawn, lookouts were replaced, and the new eyes on the horizon scanned for sails, smoke, or any sign of land. The crew had grown accustomed to the isolation of the sea, but every sighting brought the possibility of change: a merchant vessel heavy with cargo, a naval patrol, or the faint shadow of an island where fresh water and food might be found. The watchmen leaned into the morning light, their gaze unblinking, for in a pirate's life, fortune often depended on what was first seen at the break of day. As the sun climbed higher, the pace of life on the ship shifted. The long shadows stretched across the deck, the creak of the wood settled into a familiar rhythm, and the routines of the morning faded into the broader labor of the day. What began as a slow stirring of bodies and voices became the full work of maintaining a ship, a floating world that needed constant care if it was to carry its crew across hostile waters. And so, from the dim stirrings below deck, to the measured routines upon it, dawn gave way to day. The pirates had awakened, not to the thrill of battle or the romance of adventure, but to the daily grind of survival at sea, a rhythm as old as the tides and as unchanging as the horizon itself. Yet, as their tasks stretched forward into the heat of the day, the condition of the ship itself, fragile and weathered, demanded more of their attention than anything else, for without it, no dawn would ever come again. The day's light grew stronger, and as the sun lifted itself higher into the sky, the crew's attention inevitably turned toward the vessel that carried them, for the ship was not merely a tool or a stage upon which their lives unfolded, but a fragile wooden world that demanded unending care. Unlike the mighty stone walls of cities, or the solid permanence of land, the ship was a creation of timber and tar, rope and canvas, all of which strained against the elements with each passing hour. At dawn, men rose to their duties, not simply to prepare for potential battle or for travel, but to tend to the condition of the craft itself, for in neglect lay ruin, and in ruin lay death. A pirate ship was rarely a vessel built fresh from a shipyard. More often than not, it was taken, captured from merchantmen, or seized from navies, and altered to suit its new purpose. These ships bore scars of their history, scars that only deepened as days turned into months upon the sea. Wooden planks warped with the salt air, seams cracked under the strain of waves, and the masts, tall and heavy, groaned with the weight of sails pulling them forward. A ship was always in a state of slow decay, and it was the endless task of the crew to delay that decay for as long as possible. The planks of the deck were scrubbed each morning, not only for cleanliness, but to prevent the wood from rotting under layers of grime and salt. Buckets of seawater were hauled up and poured across the boards, brushes pushed back and forth until the deck glistened in the morning sun. Beneath the deck, in the dim spaces where hammocks swung and supplies were kept, tar and pitch were applied to cracks, sealing out leaks as best as could be managed. The lower hull, hidden below the surface of the sea, was prone to fouling from barnacles, seaweed and worms that bored into the wood. When the ship was near shore, Men were sometimes forced to scrape the hull or careen the vessel, pulling it onto its side to burn away or remove the infestations. It was a task of hardship and danger, but without it, the ship would grow sluggish, its speed stolen by the weight of the ocean clinging to its body. Ropes were another constant demand. Hemp lines, twisted and frayed from use, required splicing, knotting, and replacement. A single snapped rope at the wrong moment could spell disaster. A sail loosed, a mast broken, a ship suddenly vulnerable to the whims of wind and wave. Men skilled in rope work were prized, their hands always busy with coils, tying splices that blended old rope with new, keeping the vast network of rigging in working order. Above them, the sails themselves, patched and stitched countless times, caught the morning breeze. Canvas was difficult to replace, so every tier was mended quickly, with long strips of cloth sewn carefully by hand. The sound of needles pushing through fabric was as much a part of the ship's life as the crash of the sea against the hull. The guns, too, were part of the ship's condition, for they were not simply weapons but weight and structure bound into the very design of the deck. Cannons had to be secured, cleaned and inspected. The recoil of battle, when it came, placed tremendous stress upon the timbers that supported them, and loose or damaged guns could destroy men as surely as enemy fire. Thus, even in quiet days when no enemy sails graced the horizon, the gunners moved slowly about their tasks, checking ropes, cleaning barrels, and tightening the carriages that held the iron mouths of destruction in place. The condition of the ship extended beyond the wood, the rope, and the iron. It was also in the very balance of weight and storage. Barrels of water, salted meat, hardtack and powder were lashed in place, their arrangement carefully considered to keep the ship steady. A vessel too heavily weighted at the stern or bow could pitch dangerously. Too much cargo to one side could cause it to list. The quartermaster, one of the most important men aboard a pirate ship, oversaw these stores, ensuring that the balance of supplies did not endanger the craft itself. Each day, barrels were checked for leakage, sacks for spoilage, and powder for dampness, for all were vulnerable to the sea's endless moisture. A ship in poor condition was a death sentence. Pirates were often hunted by navies and merchant convoys, and their survival depended on speed and agility. A rotting hull, sagging sails, or weakened ropes could not carry men to safety when pursued, nor close the distance on a fat merchant ship ripe for plunder. Thus, the care of the vessel was more than maintenance. It was survival, the very foundation of piracy. Men grumbled at the constant work, yet they performed it, for they knew the sea spared no ship that failed in its upkeep. Still, there was a strange intimacy between crew and ship. Each plank, each rope, each patch of sail became familiar. Men who spent years aboard the same vessel came to know its sounds, the way it leaned into the wind, the way it creaked at night, and the faint shudder that ran through it in heavy seas. The ship was not a home in the sense of warmth or comfort, but it was a shelter nonetheless, the only barrier between human life and the cold, vast depths of the ocean. Its condition was not only a matter of wood and tar but of spirit. If the ship held together, so too did the men. As the day lengthened, the crew's morning labor gave way to the broader tasks of navigation and watchkeeping. The ship, maintained as best as human hands could manage, carried them steadily onward across the horizon. But even with sails patched and ropes spliced, the men who worked upon the deck were reminded constantly that the ship was never still, never finished, never safe from the ocean that sought always to break it down. And as the sun rose to its zenith, the question was not only whether the vessel could withstand the sea, but how the crew themselves could be ordered and divided to ensure the ship's fragile survival. Though the ship itself was an ever-present concern, the vessel alone could not keep the sea at bay. It required men, ordered in their tasks, each fulfilling duties that ensured the ship functioned as a whole. Pirates, unlike the rigid naval crews of great empires, did not operate under the same absolute command of a distant admiral or an unquestioned captain. Their world was smaller, bound within the wooden ribs of their vessel, and within it, the division of labor took on both practical necessity and democratic choice. For while pirate life was harsh, it was also curiously egalitarian when compared with the brutal hierarchies of the navies they opposed. Each dawn and each day that followed, the work of the ship was carried out through the roles assigned to men. These were not always permanent, for injury, sickness, or death could shift responsibilities swiftly, but the rhythm of labor divided itself into patterns. Some men were climbers, used to heights, and so they became the hands of the rigging, ascending into the web of ropes and sails that rose above the deck like the branches of some wooden forest. Their tasks were constant, tightening lines, adjusting canvas, furling or unfurling sails according to the shifting wind. High above the deck, with only rope beneath their feet, they balanced in perilous silence, their lives held in knots and hemp. Others remained closer to the deck, their hands perpetually raw from hauling ropes, coiling lines, or shifting barrels and crates to maintain the balance of weight within the hold. These men carried the strain of the ship's muscles, for it was through their labor that sails were pulled taut, anchors raised, and guns shifted. The sweat of their bodies mingled with the salt spray of the sea, and though they shared in the same meager rations as all others, their work was endless, requiring strength and endurance in equal measure. The gunners, meanwhile, bore a different responsibility. They lived half in anticipation, maintaining the iron mouths of the ship's cannons in readiness, and half in routine, for their tools required as much attention as the sails or ropes. They scrubbed barrels, checked carriages, and measured powder, ensuring that when the time for battle came, their weapons would not betray them. In quieter hours, they also assisted in the heavy lifting of stores or repairs, for no man was excused from labor. Yet when conflict appeared on the horizon, their knowledge and preparation could determine the fate of all aboard. There were also men who kept watch, stationed high upon the mast or along the rails, their eyes fixed upon the vast and shifting horizon. Their duty was among the most vital, for the first glimpse of a sail could spell fortune or doom. A merchant vessel heavy with goods might offer wealth, but a naval ship bristling with guns could bring destruction. The watchman's eyes, strained by the endless expanse of sea and sky, became finely tuned to movement. The faintest shadow of sailcloth, the dark line of coast, the smoke of a distant fire. Their word could send the crew to arms, or ease them back into the monotony of labor. Not all roles involved the strain of rope or the weight of cannon. Some were bound to skill of hand and craft. The carpenter, one of the most essential men aboard, worked with timber, saw, and nails, mending cracks, replacing planks, and shaping spars. Without him, the ship would splinter under the weight of its journey. Alongside him, the sailmaker stitched canvas, repairing rents torn by storms or battle. These men, though fewer in number, bore burdens no less critical, for their work kept the vessel itself alive. There was also the cook, a figure often overlooked yet vital, for he bore the responsibility of turning the crew's stores into meals that could sustain bodies through labor. Working in cramped quarters, surrounded by barrels of salted meat, sacks of peas and hard biscuits, he boiled, stewed and rationed. His fire had to be managed carefully, lest it spread to the wooden frame around him, and his knowledge of supplies was as critical as the quartermaster's. A cook who failed in his duty brought weakness, sickness and dissent, while one who managed with skill could make tolerable even the bland monotony of salt pork and weevil-ridden bread. The quartermaster himself held a place of authority, second only to the captain, and sometimes above him in influence. He was the keeper of stores, the allocator of rations, the arbiter of disputes, and often the one who balanced fairness among the crew. While captains held sway in times of battle, quartermasters often ruled in the long days of peace, for it was they who ensured that supplies were divided equally, loot shared according to agreement, and discipline maintained without tyranny. His role was a reminder that piracy, unlike the naval world, functioned on a form of democracy. The captain could be deposed by vote, but the quartermaster's steady presence bound the crew together. Beyond these formal roles, there were informal ones as well. Some men were singers, their voices rising in shanties that matched the rhythm of labor, easing the strain of hauling rope with the beat of sound. Others carved wood, mended clothing, or offered small services that filled the spaces between greater tasks. There were those skilled with medicine, crude though it was, tending to wounds with rum and cloth, pulling teeth, or lancing boils. Each man, whatever his task, was bound into the living fabric of the ship's community, for survival demanded contribution from all. And yet, Despite this division of labor, pirates lived with a sense of equality rare upon the sea. Shares of loot were often distributed by code, with captains receiving only slightly more than common sailors, and each man entitled to a portion. Decisions were made by vote, punishments agreed upon collectively, and grievances aired without fear of a distant authority's lash. The division of roles was necessary for function, but it did not create insurmountable walls between men. A captain might climb the rigging, a gunner might haul rope, a cook might take a turn at watch. The ship was small, the sea was vast, and no man could afford to stand apart from the labor of his fellows. By the time the sun reached its height in the sky, each man had settled into his duty, and the ship itself hummed with the rhythm of divided labor. Ropes tightened, sails shifted, water splashed across planks, and the creak of the vessel blended with the sound of human effort. The roles, though distinct, wove together into a single fabric, a pattern that repeated with each day and each voyage. Yet as bodies bent to work and hands turned raw with rope and tar, the hunger of the stomach began to gnaw once more. Labor could not continue without sustenance, and as the day pressed forward, the crew turned their eyes not to the sails or the horizon, but to the simple matter of food, meager though it was, for without it even the strongest hands faltered. By the time the ship had settled into its rhythm of labor, and the ropes were tightened, sails adjusted, and the endless repairs of wood and canvas seen to, the stomachs of the men began to remind them of the day's most familiar ritual. Work could not continue without food, and though the meals of pirates were neither luxurious nor plentiful, they were essential, for hunger weakened the hands that hauled ropes and dulled the eyes that scanned the horizon. It was in the mid-morning hours that rations were distributed, a ritual as important as the raising of sails or the tending of guns. The cook, a man whose role was often underestimated, until the first pangs of hunger made his labor evident, prepared what little could be fashioned from the ship's supplies. The food of pirates was drawn from necessity, not choice, for they carried with them what could endure the endless moisture and instability of the sea. Fresh provisions, if they existed at all, vanished quickly within days of setting out. Fruit, vegetables, and bread spoiled or turned to rot, leaving behind the hardened, salted, and dried staples that the sea demanded. Thus, the pirate's morning meal was less a feast than a negotiation with preservation. Hardtack was perhaps the most common of these rations, thick, brittle biscuits of flour and water, baked until nearly indestructible. They were called ship's biscuit, or sea bread, though many a sailor would have told you they bore little resemblance to bread in taste or comfort. Hardtack was so hard that knives were often used to break it, and many softened it by soaking it in water, grog, or stew, though even then its texture remained coarse and its flavor bland. Within weeks the biscuits often became infested with weevils, small insects that burrowed through the flour, yet hunger bred tolerance, and sailors ate them regardless, cracking the biscuits open to shake out what insects they could, and consuming the rest. Alongside hardtack came salted meat, usually beef or pork, preserved in brine within great barrels that lined the hold. Salted meat was heavy, dense, and rarely appetizing. Over time the brine could turn foul, and the meat itself often emerged tough, streaked with fat, or discolored. Still, it provided the protein needed to sustain men through long hours of physical strain. Sometimes it was boiled to soften it, at other times fried in pans if oil or fat could be spared, but more often it was simply eaten as it was, washed down with drink. Water, too, was stored in barrels, but it did not remain pure for long. Within weeks the contents of water casks often became stale, tasting of the wood and of the sea air that seeped into everything. Algae might grow within, and the water might carry a sour odor, yet it was drunk nonetheless, for thirst could not be ignored. To mask the foulness, and to stretch supplies further, pirates often turned instead to grog, a mixture of water and rum, sometimes spiced with a little sugar or citrus, if such luxuries had been taken from plunder. Grog provided not only hydration, but also a dulling of discomfort, a soft fog to ease the harshness of daily life. Rum, unlike water, kept indefinitely, and so it became the constant drink of seafarers, though its overuse could lead to quarrels, dulled senses, and slow decay of health. On occasion, peas or beans might be boiled into a thin stew, or oatmeal cooked into porridge if grain was available. Cheese, when carried, quickly soured, but in its early days at sea, it offered a welcome change from salted flesh and hard biscuits. Fish, if caught, could bring fresh flavor to a meal, but fishing required time, calm seas, and luck, and could not be relied upon as a steady source. Thus, the diet of pirates was both monotonous and inadequate, filling the belly but rarely nourishing the body. The scarcity of fresh provisions bore heavily upon health. Scurvy, the great scourge of sailors, loomed always upon ships that lacked access to fruits and vegetables. Caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, it brought swollen gums, loosened teeth, and wounds that refused to heal. Men grew weak, their bodies wasting away, despite the constant consumption of meat and bread. In later centuries, citrus became the known cure, but for pirates of the 17th and 18th centuries, scurvy remained an ever-present spectre, striking down men in their prime with slow and miserable decline. Dysentery, too, spread easily in the cramped and damp quarters of a ship, the result of spoiled food, foul water, and the impossibility of true sanitation at sea. Yet, despite its hardships, the ritual of rations provided structure to the day. The quartermaster or cook oversaw the division of supplies, and fairness was enforced by code, for one man's hunger was no less than another's, and unequal shares bred dissent. Meals were eaten quickly, often upon the deck, the men crouched or seated where they could find space, their food balanced in rough wooden bowls, or simply in their hands. Conversation was minimal, for eating was not a pleasure but a necessity, though sometimes a shanty might be sung, or a story told, as men chewed their biscuits and salted pork. The smell of boiling stew or fried meat, when such things could be managed, carried across the deck, and mingled with the ever-present odor of tar, rope and sea. The clatter of bowls, the splash of grog poured from casks, and the crunch of hardtack filled the air. The ship continued its journey regardless, sails straining against the wind, the deck shifting beneath the men's feet. Yet for a brief span of time, all eyes and thoughts turned toward food. In those moments, the unity of the crew was felt most clearly. Men who moments before had been aloft in the rigging, or crouched at the guns, gathered together, sharing the same meager fare. Whatever their rank or skill, they were equal in their hunger, and equal in the relief that came from eating. Even in scarcity, the distribution of food bound them together, reminding them that survival was not the burden of one but of all. Yet, once the bowls were emptied, and the last of the grog drained, the hunger of the day was only temporarily sated. Labor awaited, and the ship demanded constant attention. Food could fill the belly for a time, but it could not still the sea, nor replace the need for endless vigilance. And so, with the faint taste of salt still lingering on their tongues, the men returned to their duties, knowing that their survival rested not only on the strength of their bodies, but on the eyes that kept watch over the endless horizon. Yet, as the men wiped the last crumbs of hardtack from their hands, and the final drops of grog were swallowed, the day's work did not soften. Hunger might have been sated for the moment, but the sea offered no peace, and the ship carried always with it the shadow of danger. For pirates, life was bound not only to the labor of ropes and sails, but to the constant readiness for violence. Though days might pass in monotonous labor without sight of another vessel, the possibility of sudden conflict hung over them like the heavy weight of a storm. Thus, after the morning meal, many turned their hands to the slow and steady maintenance of weapons, for steel and powder were as important to survival as food or water. The cleaning of pistols was among the most meticulous tasks, carried out with deliberate care, for the flintlock weapons that pirates carried were as unreliable as they were deadly. Each pistol, often taken from captured ships or bought through illicit trade, was a fragile instrument of wood, steel, and flint. Powder fouling, salt air and moisture worked against its function, corroding barrels, rusting locks and dampening the fine powder upon which its fire depended. To neglect a pistol was to risk one's life when the moment of combat arrived. Men sat upon the deck, their backs against barrels or the rail, dismantling their pistols piece by piece. They wiped the barrels with oiled cloths, ran brushes through the chambers, and checked the springs of the locks. The smell of gun oil mingled with the sharper scent of black powder, both clinging to their hands and clothing. Flint was inspected, sharpened if needed, or replaced, for a dull flint meant a sparkless strike, and a sparkless strike meant death. Powder horns were checked for cracks, cartridges rolled anew from paper, and small pouches of shot carefully tied. These rituals were repeated daily, not because pirates expected combat at every hour, but because they could never be sure when it would come. Beside the pistols lay the cutlasses, short, broad swords of iron that had become the very emblem of piracy. Unlike the long, slender swords favored by naval officers or soldiers on land, cutlasses were designed for close fighting in the cramped spaces of a ship's deck, where wide swings were hindered and quick, brutal strokes mattered most. The blades, simple and functional, required constant sharpening. Men drew whetstones slowly along the edges, producing a steady rasping sound that carried across the deck like a dull chant. The iron was cleaned with oil to resist the creeping rust of sea air, and hilts wrapped or re-wrapped with cloth or leather for a firmer grip. These swords were not treasures, but tools, their value measured only in their readiness to cut. Other weapons, too, demanded attention. Boarding axes with short handles and sharp blades, served both in combat and in daily labor, used to cut through rope or wood in emergency, but also as deadly instruments in boarding actions. Muskets, longer than pistols but equally prone to failure, were cleaned and tested, their stocks polished to resist splitting, their barrels checked for cracks. Powder for the great cannons below deck was measured and stored, kept dry in barrels sealed as best they could be, though the dampness of the sea was a constant enemy. Cannonballs, stacked in neat pyramids near the guns, were checked for damage, for even a single flaw could cause misfire. The process of preparation was slow, deliberate, and repetitive. Hours might be spent sharpening, oiling, and checking, even when no enemy was in sight. To a casual observer, it might have seemed unnecessary, the work of men idle in their fear. Yet among those who lived by the law of the sea, this quiet readiness was survival itself. A single pistol failing to fire, a blade dulled, or a cannon left uncleaned, could mean the difference between victory and slaughter. And unlike the well-equipped navies of great nations, pirates relied on what they had stolen. Replacements were not easily found. But there was another purpose to this constant tending of arms. It filled the silence, gave order to idle hours, and focused minds that might otherwise wander into restlessness. A pirate ship was not always aflame with action. Often it drifted through weeks of monotony, the sea stretching endlessly in all directions. To sharpen, to clean, to prepare, these gave rhythm to the long hours of waiting, a rhythm that calmed even as it reminded them of violence. The rasp of stone on steel, the clink of powder horn, the smell of oil and tar, these became part of the daily music of the ship, alongside the creak of timber and the cry of gulls. And though the men worked with care, there was no illusion about what this labor meant. Each pistol cleaned was a pistol meant to kill. Each cutlass sharpened was sharpened to cut flesh. Each cannonball stacked was a weight of iron destined to tear through wood and bone alike. The weapons of pirates were not ceremonial, not polished for show or parade. They were tools of brutality, meant to strike quickly and decisively before order could be restored. Pirates did not often fight fair battles. They struck with suddenness, overwhelming their prey with noise, fire, and steel, before resistance could take hold. Their weapons then were not instruments of honor, but of survival and fear. The men who tended to them knew this, and in their slow rituals lay the unspoken acceptance of what their lives demanded. Violence was not constant, but it was always near, waiting beyond the horizon in the silhouette of another ship. The preparation of weapons was not a choice but an inevitability, as bound to their existence as the sea itself. When the pistols were reassembled, the flints tightened, the barrels oiled, and the blades sharpened to fine edges, the men laid them beside their bunks or strapped them to belts, always within reach. Powder and shot were stored but carried close when suspicion grew. The cannons, though immovable in their weight, were kept in readiness, their ropes coiled neatly, their tampions fitted, their powder dry. The ship itself became a floating arsenal, disguised by sails and wood, but bristling with iron and fire beneath its surface. And so the day pressed forward, the men moving between labor of sail and labor of steel, knowing that the horizon might remain empty, or might tomorrow bring a prize or a pursuer. Weapons prepared, bellies partially filled, sails trimmed, and ropes taut, the ship continued its ceaseless journey. The sea rolled beneath, the sky stretched vast above, and life aboard returned again to its endless cycle of toil and vigilance. Yet while the readiness for violence filled the hours, the horizon itself demanded as much care as the pistol or cutlass. For no weapon mattered if the watch failed, if eyes grew dull or inattentive, and the shadow of another sail slipped past unseen. And so while some men cleaned steel and iron, others climbed once more into the rigging, or leaned upon the rail, their eyes fixed outward, scanning the vast empty expanse for the first sign of opportunity or threat. Even as weapons were tended and sharpened, and the smell of oil and powder lingered on the deck, the greater task of keeping the ship upon its course pressed forward in its own steady rhythm. For a pirate ship, unlike a merchantman bound to a fixed trade route, or a naval vessel under orders, navigation was less about precise timetables, and more about freedom and survival. Yet it was no less vital, for a ship that lost its way risked drifting into barren seas where no plunder could be found, where supplies ran out, and where hunger and thirst claimed the crew long before battle ever could. Thus, amid the daily routines of maintenance and preparation, there remained always the quiet labor of direction, the calm, methodical work of men who read the world not from roads or landmarks, but from water, sky, and memory. The captain or quartermaster, often assisted by the sailing master, if such an experienced navigator could be found among them, was responsible for this hidden art. Their tools were few, yet they formed the very spine of survival. A compass, protected from the dampness of salt air and rough handling, was perhaps the most constant guide, its needle trembling gently as the ship rolled, pointing always north regardless of storm or calm. With this simple device, a man could tell direction even when clouds hid the stars. Though compasses of the 17th and 18th centuries were far from perfect, their needles easily disturbed by the iron of weapons or nails in the deck. Alongside the compass were charts, maps often crude, incomplete, or outdated, for pirates did not usually carry the fine detailed charts of naval officers. What maps they did have were often stolen, traded, or copied, showing coasts, harbors, and islands where water and food might be found, or where rich shipping lanes carried merchant vessels heavy with goods. These maps were drawn by hand, with ink fading and edges fraying from salt spray, yet they were treasured nonetheless. For many pirates, especially those who had once been sailors in merchant or naval service, the knowledge of currents, reefs, and safe anchorages was as important as any cutlass. But the sea itself could not always be reduced to paper. Much of navigation depended upon experience, the knowledge of winds and tides, the feel of the ship beneath the feet, the sight of birds wheeling far out from land. Pirates, like all seafarers, watched the natural world with constant attention, for it was their only assurance in a vast and indifferent ocean. At night, when clouds cleared, the stars became their truest map. Constellations guided their course, the North Star offering its steady light to those in the northern hemisphere, while the Southern Cross gave guidance to those farther below the equator. Men trained their eyes to follow these patterns, learning how the heavens shifted as the hours passed, and how the slow turning of the earth changed their placement with the seasons. The sun, too, was a guide. At dawn and dusk, it gave bearings, rising in the east and setting in the west, a simple truth that even the least trained sailor understood. By measuring the height of the sun at noon with a cross staff, or later, a sextant, if such instruments were available, navigators could estimate latitude, knowing roughly how far north or south they had traveled. Longitude, however, remained far more difficult to measure in the age of piracy, for the reliable marine chronometer that later solved the problem had not yet been invented. Instead, sailors relied upon dead reckoning, estimating distance traveled by measuring speed with a log line and calculating time by sandglass. It was a method prone to error, but it was often the best they had. To the men on deck, the process of navigation was less visible than the hauling of sails or the firing of cannons, but it was no less critical. A miscalculation could lead them into shoals where the ship might run aground, or far off course into stretches of sea where no ship might be found for weeks. And so, while the common crew went about their tasks of cleaning, repairing and keeping watch, the navigators bent over their maps, traced lines with compasses, and marked positions as best they could, measuring the endless sea in fragile strokes of ink. Pirates were often accused by their enemies of being reckless men, driven by greed and violence rather than skill. Yet the truth was more complex. Many among them were seasoned sailors, men who had once served aboard naval ships or merchant vessels, and who carried with them the knowledge of coasts and waters. Others learned through necessity, for a pirate crew could not afford ignorance. Without skilled navigation, no amount of courage or weaponry could keep them alive. It was this mixture of boldness and seamanship that allowed pirates to strike suddenly in waters from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, slipping past patrols, finding hidden anchorages, and appearing where least expected. The act of direction was not hurried, but measured. At intervals throughout the day, speed was checked, bearings were taken, and the course was adjusted. The sound of the log line splashing into the sea, the sand glass turned in steady rhythm, the quiet scratching of quill upon map, these formed another layer of the ship's soundscape, more subdued than the crash of waves or the rasp of steel, but no less vital. The crew might not have noticed it consciously, but this rhythm kept them from drifting into the aimless terror of the sea. Sometimes, when close to shore, pirates relied less on instruments, and more on memory and sight. A jagged cliff, a line of palms, the shape of a bay, these became familiar markers, learned from years of sailing the same waters. Hidden coves provided shelter, where repairs could be made or plunder divided, and the men who knew their locations were valued highly. In this way, knowledge became a weapon as sharp as any blade, passed from sailor to sailor, in muttered words, or taken by force when a captured navigator was pressed into service. Navigation, then, was not a matter of grand adventure, but of patient repetition. It was a quiet duty, often thankless, but always essential. As the sun arced slowly across the sky, and the waves rolled without end, the pirates depended upon this steady art to bring them to prey, to guide them to safety, and to return them, if fortune favored, to their hidden havens where loot might be divided, and ships repaired. And so, as weapons lay sharpened and food settled uneasily in their stomachs, the men returned to their endless vigil of sea and sky. The sails strained against the wind, the compass needle trembled in its case, and the stars waited for nightfall to reveal their secrets once more. The ship pressed forward, not toward a fixed destination, but into the uncertainty that was their existence, guided only by the fragile balance of experience, tools, and chance. The day, however, was far from over, for while direction was plotted and the ship steered, the crew itself needed order, the fragile structure that kept lawless men from chaos. And so, beneath the creak of timbers and the cry of seabirds, the rhythms of discipline began to take shape, enforced not by navy officers, but by the rough codes pirates had written for themselves. Though the ship pressed forward across waters marked by wind and compass, though the sails strained above and the timbers groaned below, what truly sustained the vessel was not merely navigation or weapons, nor even the scant food that filled the bellies of its men, but rather the fragile but enduring order that governed the lives of those aboard. A pirate ship, unlike the rigid hierarchies of navies or merchant vessels, was structured upon something altogether unusual for its time, a form of democracy, a collective agreement among men who had often been denied any say in the lives they once led. It was this order, delicate but firm, that made the difference between chaos and cooperation, between mutiny and survival, and it unfolded each day in the rhythm of work and decision-making on the open deck. The social structure of pirate life was not arbitrary, nor was it based solely upon brute strength or charisma, though both played their roles. At its heart lay the articles, written codes of conduct drawn up and agreed upon by the crew, often signed or marked at the beginning of a voyage. These articles varied from ship to ship, yet they tended to outline the same fundamental principles: how loot would be divided, how disputes would be settled, What punishments awaited those who stole from the common store, deserted their duty, or disobeyed orders in battle? Unlike the strict naval codes of kings and admirals, which imposed obedience through rank and punishment, pirate codes were contracts, agreements freely entered into by men who had chosen this life, binding not by law but by necessity. Within this framework, leadership existed, but it was not absolute. The captain of a pirate vessel held authority primarily in times of pursuit or combat, when quick decisions could mean the difference between victory and death. His word then was law, and hesitation could not be afforded. Yet outside of battle, the captain's power was restrained. Decisions about where to sail, whom to attack, how to distribute supplies, and even whether to continue following a leader at all, were made collectively. The quartermaster, often elected by the crew, wielded considerable influence as well, overseeing the distribution of loot, maintaining fairness in rations, and serving as the voice of the men. If the captain was the figure of action, the quartermaster was the figure of balance, ensuring that greed or arrogance did not fracture the crew's fragile unity. On deck, this balance manifested itself in small but significant ways. Disputes between men, which could easily erupt into violence in such close quarters, were sometimes settled not by immediate brawling, but by appeals to the quartermaster or to the articles themselves. Duels were occasionally permitted, fought with pistols or cutlasses upon neutral ground, but the rules for such encounters were laid out, and interference by others was forbidden. Theft from a comrade, particularly from the common stores of food or powder, was regarded as among the gravest of offences, for it threatened not only the victim, but the survival of all. Punishments could be harsh: marooning upon a desolate island with a pistol and a small supply of water, or in lesser cases, whipping or loss of shares from plunder. Yet these measures were not arbitrary cruelty. They were agreed upon beforehand, the collective judgment of the crew, applied to protect the whole. The distribution of loot, when it came, reflected the same sense of rough equality. Unlike naval ships, where officers took the lion's share and common sailors received meager wages, pirate crews divided their spoils according to shares, predetermined by the articles. The captain and quartermaster might receive larger portions, as befitted their roles, but never so much as to create resentment. A gunner, a carpenter, or a skilled navigator might also be granted additional shares, for their expertise was indispensable. Yet even the lowliest deckhand, whose labor was hauling ropes or swabbing decks, was assured of a portion greater than he would ever have seen under the flag of king or merchant. In this way, piracy offered men not only freedom, but the prospect of reward more equal than that of the societies they had left behind. The day-to-day enforcement of this order could be seen in small details scattered across the deck. Men who shirked their duties were quickly noticed, their laziness brought before the quartermaster. Those who fought without cause were separated, their punishment determined later when tempers had cooled. When a decision loomed, whether to pursue a ship spotted on the horizon, whether to risk a blockade, whether to anchor at a known cove, the crew gathered to discuss, voices rising and falling with the weight of opinion. Though not every man's voice carried equal force, the collective mattered, and the captain who ignored it too often soon found himself replaced. It would be misleading, however, to suggest that pirate society was free of hierarchy or domination. Strength, reputation, and skill still commanded respect, and men feared those whose tempers were violent or whose courage in battle set them apart. Yet even the fiercest captain remained bound by the articles, for without them his authority dissolved. This tension created a unique environment aboard the ship, one where liberty and equality existed not in lofty ideals, but in practical necessity. For without cooperation, the ship would founder, and all would perish together. The fairness of shares and the voice in decision-making created bonds among men who otherwise might have turned against one another. Many pirates had been pressed unwillingly into naval service, whipped by officers and denied wages. Others had labored aboard merchant ships for meager pay, watched as captains grew rich while they scraped by. For such men, piracy was more than rebellion. It was a chance to live, however briefly, under a system where their voices mattered, where their risks were rewarded, and where their comrades were equals in both hardship and fortune. Of course, this rough democracy did not erase the ever-present brutality of the sea, or the violence of their trade. Life aboard remained harsh, disputes still turned bloody, and greed could poison even the fairest systems. Yet compared to the rigid and unequal structures of the world they had rejected, the pirate ship offered something closer to balance, and it was this balance that gave them strength. For a time it made them not only freebooters upon the sea, but also practitioners, in their own crude way, of a form of equality the wider world had scarcely imagined. As the day stretched onward, this order continued to hold the ship together, as vital in its way as compass or sail. The men worked, argued, laughed, and suffered within its framework, knowing that tomorrow might bring battle, or hunger, or storm, but that today they remained bound to one another by choice as much as by circumstance. And when the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the deck, the social order persisted, its unwritten weight guiding men through the long hours of uncertainty that defined their lives at sea. And with the evening approaching, as the horizon softened and the winds shifted, thoughts turned not to discipline or order, but to the duties of those who stood watch, for the safety of all rested on the eyes that scanned the endless expanse where danger might appear at any moment. As the morning hours bled slowly into midday, and the watchman squinted at the horizon under the sharp brightness of the day, the rhythm of the ship fell into a heavy lull, not of rest but of stillness imposed by the unrelenting sun. The heat of the midday hours was not a fleeting discomfort, but an oppressive presence that draped itself across the deck like a weighted cloth, pressing down upon every man, every plank, and every rope. With the sails stretched taut against the masts, and the endless sea shimmering beneath the clear sky, the world seemed to grow narrower, enclosed not by walls but by light and heat. The deck itself bore the sun's intensity. Wooden planks, darkened by tar, and polished smooth by the passage of countless boots, grew hot to the touch, radiating warmth upward with every step. Men who labored barefoot found the soles of their feet stung by the heated boards, and those who sought shade discovered that shade itself was a luxury in short supply. The rigging provided none, nor did the great sails, for though their fabric billowed broad and white above, they too caught the sun, glowing almost translucent and casting only fragmented shadows across the deck. The sails, strained by the wind, groaned softly as they held their taut positions, while ropes creaked in time with the ship's rolling body. Every knot, every line, every pulley was warmed by the day, the tar used to preserve them softening in the heat, and giving off its pungent resinous odor. The men, for their part, worked slowly, their shirts often stripped away, skin glistening with sweat that clung to hair and dripped along the contours of arms and backs. No task was ever truly paused, for the ship permitted no idleness, but work slowed, measured not in bursts of vigor, but in the steady endurance needed to survive hours under the unbroken sky. Above, the sun moved with agonizing slowness. In the age before clocks, time at sea was often marked by the sun's progress, by the angle of its light against the sails and the shadows it cast upon the deck. Midday was known not only by its brilliance, but by the sense that the day had reached a crest, a height from which the hours would gradually decline. Yet for those living upon the deck, it felt endless, as if the world had grown still under its watch. The men's faces bore the toll, lips dried and cracked, their tongues often parched, though water and grog might be sparingly drawn from barrels to ward off thirst. Sweat pooled beneath collars and trickled along spines, soaking into the coarse linen and wool garments they wore, which clung to skin heavy with salt. The air itself was thick with the mingled scents of sweat, tar, salt water and wood, an atmosphere both suffocating and familiar. The cries of seabirds when they came, carried strangely clear across the bright air, but often there was no sound save for the slap of water against the hull, and the low groan of the ship's frame, expanding and contracting under the heat. In these hours, thoughts turned inward. The monotony of the horizon, broken only by the faint curve of sea and sky, lulled men into reflection. Some thought of ports they had left behind, of taverns with shaded courtyards and the taste of fresh bread or fruit, luxuries now distant. Others thought of their shares yet to be earned, of the possibility of silver and coin that might one day free them from the endless cycle of hunger and toil. Still others simply endured, their minds quieted by exhaustion, their bodies surrendering to the rhythm of labor under the burning light. The sea itself reflected the sun's power. Its surface shone like a great mirror, fragments of light scattering and dancing with every ripple, so bright at times that the eyes watered from the effort of watching. Heat shimmered on the horizon, bending the line of sea and sky into strange distortions, as if distant sails might appear only to dissolve into mirage. The stillness of the waters on calm days was deceptive, for even when no storm brewed, the immensity of the sea pressed down upon the senses, its vastness made sharper under the weight of the sun. Midday meals, when taken, were simple and often hurried. Hardtack, salted meat, perhaps a spoonful of beans or stew, if the cook had managed to coax something more substantial from the stores. The men ate in silence more often than not, conserving energy for the long hours ahead. Drinks of grog or water were welcome, though the barrels often yielded liquid that was warm and stale, carrying faint flavors of wood and salt. Still it was swallowed gratefully, for thirst grew sharper under the sun than hunger ever could. The ship's animals, when present, goats, hens, or the occasional pig kept alive until slaughter, also wilted in the heat, their movements slow, their bodies restless under the unbroken glare. Dogs, sometimes carried as companions, lay sprawled against shaded corners, panting in the stale air. The presence of such creatures reminded men of the land they had left, of farms and villages, where the rhythms of life were set not by sails and winds, but by fields and soil. The hierarchy and codes of conduct that defined the ship remained in place during these hours, though enforcement often required less energy, for few men had the strength or will to quarrel when the sun drained all vitality from their limbs. Disputes, when they arose, were postponed until cooler hours, when tempers might flare more easily. Midday, in contrast, was marked by a quiet resignation, an endurance of heat that bound the men together in shared discomfort. The physical toll of the midday hours was not without consequence. Skin burned under constant exposure, turning red, blistered, and later darkened into toughened layers that bore the marks of countless voyages. Eyes strained against the glare, some men eventually suffering lasting damage from the unshielded light of the open sea. Dehydration weakened the body, leaving muscles sore and reflexes slow. Yet such hardships were accepted as the cost of life at sea, for no man who sailed upon those waters believed himself spared from suffering. The stillness, however, carried with it a kind of eerie peace, for in those hours, when the sun was highest and the world seemed suspended in its gaze, danger often felt distant. Ships were rarely spotted under the midday glare, and storms brewed more commonly in evenings or nights than in the brilliance of noon. The monotony, though wearisome, was a form of reprieve, a moment when the horizon remained empty, and the sea, though immense, seemed for a time subdued. And yet, even as the men labored slowly and the ship moved forward under the weight of the sun, the knowledge lingered that such stillness was temporary. The day, like the sea itself, shifted constantly, and soon enough, shadows would lengthen, winds might rise, and duties would again demand all attention. For now, however, the men endured, their world narrowed to planks, sails, ropes, and the unyielding sun above. It was in this suspended atmosphere, this heavy pause beneath the blazing sky, that the hours stretched longest, and in their passage, the ship seemed to drift not only across the sea but through time itself, each moment marked by sweat, strain, and the faint creak of the vessel that carried them forward. And when, at last, the sun began to decline from its highest place, the ship shifted once again into a new rhythm, the afternoon bringing not ease, but the stirring of labor renewed, as men returned with weary determination to the endless work of tending their floating world. When the hours of labor had been endured, and the worst heat of the day began its slow decline, the atmosphere aboard shifted, not into silence, for the sea permitted no true idleness, but into a rhythm less dictated by sweat and necessity, and more by the ways in which men sought to pass the time that stretched endlessly before them. For though pirates lived lives marked by violence, pursuit, and sudden bursts of danger, the truth of their existence at sea was often one of long stretches of monotony, of horizons unchanged for weeks, and of waiting that tested both body and mind. In those stretches of relative quiet, when sails were trimmed, the ship steady, and no chase visible upon the wide waters, the crew turned to the simple diversions that filled the void. Leisure on a pirate ship did not resemble leisure on land. There were no taverns to enter, no marketplaces to stroll, no theatres or inns where distraction might be purchased. Instead, the diversions that arose were born of necessity, created from what was available: scraps of wood, bone, cloth, dice, carved crudely from ivory or knuckle bones, and voices that could lift songs into the air. It was a leisure both meagre and essential, for without such moments of release, the confinement of a crowded ship, the constant proximity of other men, and the unchanging sameness of the sea would wear the mind thin. One of the most common pastimes was gambling, particularly with dice. Men carried with them small cubes, crudely fashioned, often with uneven edges that bore the marks of knives or chisels used in their creation. These dice rattled in cups or hands, thrown upon the deck where wagers were made in coin, in shares of plunder yet to come, or in personal possessions such as knives, trinkets or clothing. Gambling carried its risks, not only in the loss of goods, but in the disputes that followed when accusations of cheating arose. Yet it persisted, for it offered a rush of chance, a momentary break from monotony, and the possibility, however small, of gain. Dice clattered against the wood, men leaned close to see the outcome, and for a brief while, the sea itself seemed to fade into the background. Beyond gambling, carving was another frequent diversion. The ship offered no shortage of material: pieces of wood from spare planks, scraps trimmed from repairs, or bones from meals. With knives, men shaped these into small figures, pipes, spoons or decorative pieces. Some carved tokens for luck, small charms meant to bring fortune in future battles, or to ward off sickness. Others carved likenesses of women or animals, reminders of lands far away. The work was slow, meticulous, and absorbing, providing a measure of calm in an otherwise restless existence. The act of shaping something from raw material, of leaving a mark upon wood or bone, was a way of asserting humanity against the vast indifferent sea. Songs, too, filled the hours. Sea shanties, rhythmic and repetitive, were sung not only during labor, but in leisure, when voices rose without the accompaniment of ropes pulled or sails hoisted. These songs carried verses passed down through generations of sailors, altered and reshaped by memory, each crew adding its own flavor. Some told of love left behind, of women waiting in distant ports. Others mocked authority, spinning tales of kings, captains or naval officers, their words given edge by the rebellious spirit of piracy. Still others were simple work chants turned to entertainment, their steady cadence soothing in the monotony. The sound of voices, carried across the deck and into the open air, gave shape to the hours, and in the harmonies, however rough, the men found a sense of fellowship. Storytelling was another diversion, though less formal than song. Men spoke of past voyages, of battles survived, of narrow escapes from storms or prisons. Tales of plunder were told and retold, growing larger with each telling, until the lines between truth and embellishment blurred. There were also stories of lands far beyond, of cities glittering with wealth, of jungles filled with creatures and dangers, of islands rumored to hold buried treasure. These stories, passed around in quiet conversation or in larger groups during calm nights, served to knit together the crew's sense of shared purpose, binding them in dreams of what might yet be found. Cards occasionally appeared, though less commonly than dice, for cards were harder to preserve at sea. When present, they were treasured, often greasy and worn from use, their corners bent, their designs faded. Games of chance with cards followed much the same pattern as dice, wagers laid upon outcomes, fortunes won and lost in the space of an evening. The fragility of the cards, however, meant they were valued, passed carefully between players, protected from dampness as much as possible. Some men turned their time to more practical crafts, mending clothing or fashioning small tools. Needles threaded through torn shirts, patches sewn into breeches, repairs made with whatever materials could be found. Hammocks were stitched where they frayed, ropes spliced into belts, or scraps of sailcloth reshaped into bags or coverings. Though not entertainment in the truest sense, such tasks provided occupation for the hands, filling hours that might otherwise weigh heavily upon the mind. Animals, too, became part of leisure when present. A ship's dog might provide companionship, its antics drawing laughter from the men, or a parrot, brightly feathered, might be taught words or phrases, its squawks breaking the monotony of the day. Even the less glamorous livestock offered diversion, for watching a goat or pig move clumsily across the swaying deck was sometimes enough to spark amusement. Such creatures reminded the crew of the land, of farms and taverns, of a world beyond the narrow confines of their ship. In quieter moments, some men simply stared at the sea, their thoughts turned inward, the vastness of water both soothing and daunting. To gaze at the endless horizon was to feel the smallness of the human frame, yet it was also to be lulled by the constancy of the waves, their rise and fall a rhythm older than memory. For men who lived constantly in danger, such reflection was a rare form of peace. Yet leisure was never entirely free of tension. Gambling could lead to quarrels, songs to disputes over words, stories to accusations of lies. The line between camaraderie and conflict was thin, and the same diversions that bound the crew together could just as easily divide them. The Articles of Agreement, the code that governed pirate life, often included rules against disputes over games of chance, for leaders knew how quickly blood could be spilled in the name of dice or cards. Discipline, when required, was enforced, though more often men found their own ways to settle grievances, whether through words, blows, or simply letting tempers cool. But in the broader scope, these diversions were what gave life texture in the long stretches between raids. Without them, the days would blur into an endless chain of labor and hunger, broken only by danger. With them, even the smallest act, a carved token, a song lifted to the air, a throw of dice, offered a reminder of humanity, of joy, of the bonds between men sharing the same fragile wooden world upon the vast sea. And when the sun dipped lower, and shadows lengthened across the deck, the hours of leisure gave way once more to the duties of evening. For as day turned to night, the ship required attention anew, and the fragile peace of games and songs yielded again to the unceasing demands of survival. As the last echoes of dice rattling against the planks faded, and the final song of the day gave way to silence, what remained was the presence that had always been there, the constant companion of every man who lived aboard the ship, the sea itself. Its sound, ever shifting yet eternal, filled every corner of the vessel, seeping into sleep, into labor, into thought. For the men who lived their lives entirely upon the waves, it was not merely background, but a rhythm that shaped existence, a steady, inexorable heartbeat that neither quickened nor slowed, no matter the fortunes of those who sailed upon it. The sound began with the waves, their movements striking endlessly against the hull. Each roll of the ship brought a deep thud as water pressed against the wood, a reminder of the vessel's fragility against the vast weight of the ocean. Sometimes it was a gentle slap, the sound of calm seas lapping playfully against the planks. At other times it was heavier, deeper, a crash that reverberated through timbers, vibrating up through the very boards upon which men slept. Even when the sea was calm, the noise did not cease. It became instead a soft murmuring, like breath, constant and inescapable. To some it was soothing, a lullaby of sorts, pulling them into uneasy rest. To others, it was a reminder of danger, for that same lapping could become, in a storm, a roar that threatened to swallow ship and crew alike. Layered atop the water's rhythm was the creak of the ship itself. The wooden body of the vessel was never still. As waves lifted and lowered it, as sails shifted under the pull of the wind, the timbers groaned, joints tightened and released, ropes strained with a low hum. These creaks were as familiar to pirates as their own heartbeats, and in their familiarity lay both reassurance and warning. A certain groan meant the ship was sound, flexing as it was meant to. Another, sharper and less steady, might signal a part under strain, a weakness that could grow if left untended. To the untrained ear, the ship's noises might seem chaotic, but to those who lived aboard, each had meaning. Each told a story of motion, of stress, of endurance. Then there was the wind, moving not only the ship itself, but also filling the air with sound. In calm weather it whispered, brushing lightly against sails and ropes, rustling like leaves in a distant forest. In stronger breezes it whistled through rigging, producing tones both high and low, music born without intention, yet constant in its presence. When storms gathered, the wind rose to a howl, a scream that tore through the air and drowned out voices, making communication difficult, leaving men to gesture rather than shout. At night, when eyes grew weary and the horizon was lost in darkness, the wind's sound was often the only guide to what lay ahead, its direction, its intensity, its shifts telling the helmsman how to steer, the crew how to brace. Birds, too, lent their voices to the sea's chorus, though less frequently once the ship was far from shore. Near land gulls circled above, their cries sharp and piercing, mingling with the crash of surf. To sailors, these calls were often welcome, a sign that land was near, even before it could be sighted. At sea, the occasional bird might still be heard, resting upon the rigging or flying overhead, its voice strange and lonely in the emptiness. Such sounds, rare amid the vast waters, broke the monotony and reminded the crew of the world beyond the endless waves. All these elements, the waves, the creaks, the wind, the birds blended into a single environment, one that pirates could not escape. On land, silence could be found, in forests, in fields, in quiet rooms. At sea, silence was unknown. The ocean was never still, never quiet. Its voice was always present. For men who lived weeks and months aboard their ships, this ceaseless sound worked its way into the mind, sometimes soothing, sometimes maddening. Some found comfort in it, sleeping easily with the roll of waves and the groan of timbers. Others grew restless, longing for the quiet of land, for stillness never granted at sea. In the still moments of evening, when work was done and the crew's diversions had quieted, the sound of the sea grew most apparent. It was then that men lay in hammocks, or upon the deck, their thoughts carried by the ceaseless rhythm. For some it was a time of reflection, the noise of the water matching the currents of memory, carrying them back to lives left behind, families, homes, places where sound came not from waves, but from voices and familiar surroundings. For others, it was a time of resignation, a reminder that their lives were bound to the sea now, that the sound which filled their ears each night would be their companion, until fortune or fate released them. The hypnotic nature of the sea's sound also shaped behavior. Long voyages, marked by weeks of the same auditory backdrop, dulled the senses, made time blur. Days merged, distinctions between one week and the next grew faint. The sound was both measure and erasure of time, its constancy a reminder that human lives were brief against the endless expanse of the ocean. It lulled men into a strange rhythm of existence, where life became less about events and more about endurance. At times men sought to escape the sound, though escape was impossible. They might cover their ears with cloth, bury their heads in hammocks, or focus upon conversation or song. Yet the sea intruded still, its rhythm present even when muffled. To live upon a pirate ship was to live within this sound, to have it define one's waking and sleeping, one's labor and one's leisure. And so, as night deepened and stars emerged above, the ship carried on through the dark waters, its men half asleep, half awake, surrounded by the ceaseless murmur of waves and timbers. The sound became the true captain of their lives, dictating pace and patience, reminding them with every crash and creak that they were guests upon an ocean that tolerated them only so long as chance and fortune allowed. And yet, within the unchanging backdrop of waves and winds, there were moments when the monotony was broken, moments that could alter the course of a voyage in ways great or small. These moments began most often with a cry from a man high in the rigging, or with the quiet pointing of a hand toward the faint outline of something unnatural on the horizon. Another ship, nothing more than a few specks of canvas at first, yet to those aboard a pirate vessel, such a sight was enough to stir thoughts, not in shouts or sudden excitement, but in the slow, watchful silence that accompanied the weighing of choices. A sail upon the horizon meant possibilities. It could be prey, a merchant vessel heavy with cargo, its holds packed with goods stolen from colonies, or shipped home to ports in Europe. It could be an enemy, a naval ship, armed and ordered to hunt down those who defied the crown. It could be something neutral, another privateer, another pirate, or a wandering trader with little of value aboard. But from the moment the faint curve of canvas appeared against the edge of the sea, men knew that their fate in the hours ahead might be reshaped entirely. The process of encountering another ship was slow, for distances on the ocean were vast, and the pace of sailing vessels measured not in minutes but in hours. A sighting might be made in the morning, and yet the two ships not come near enough for decision until late in the afternoon. During that long span, the crew waited, their eyes straining against the light, gauging wind and direction, measuring whether their course would bring them closer together or farther apart. The quartermaster might speak quietly with the captain, consulting the articles, considering their supplies, weighing the risk of combat against the lure of plunder. Each man aboard had his thoughts, though most kept them to themselves, their faces turned toward the horizon as if watching might somehow hasten the decision. It was not always pursuit. Pirates did not attack indiscriminately, for their survival depended not upon reckless bravery but upon calculation. A ship that appeared too large, with too many guns or too many men, was often avoided. To engage such an enemy would risk not only death, but the loss of the ship itself, which was the only home and hope the crew possessed. Likewise, a vessel that seemed too swift, rigged for speed, rather than for burden, might be ignored, for a chase across open waters could waste precious days and stores, leaving the pirates hungrier and no richer for their effort. And sometimes, even if the ship was within their means, the decision was made to let it pass, for reasons that might never be spoken aloud, but were felt all the same: weariness from a recent battle, a desire to conserve powder and shot, or simply the fatigue of men who had lived too long upon salted meat and stale water. When pursuit was chosen, it was not announced in thunder but in quiet preparation. Sails were trimmed, ropes tightened, the course adjusted to bring the ship into alignment. Men went to their weapons, pistols cleaned earlier in the day now checked again, cutlasses at their sides. The gunners, those whose task it was to load and fire the great cannons, began their slow work, hauling powder and shot, arranging tools so they might be ready at the moment of need. Still, hours might pass with little change, as distance closed so gradually that it seemed the horizon itself was reluctant to grant satisfaction. When avoidance was the choice, the mood was different but no less tense. Sails might be altered to steer away, the crew keeping eyes fixed upon the ship until it faded into haze or darkness. The sound of the sea seemed louder then, filling the space left by anticipation, reminding men that their life was not solely about the chase, but also about endurance, patience and survival. For every merchant ship captured, many others were sighted and passed by, their stories never written into pirate lore, but no less real for those who watched them vanish into the distance. There were also encounters not of enemy or prey but of kinship, though such moments were rare. On occasion, two pirate vessels might cross paths, or a privateer might hail them. Then the sea, which so often isolated, briefly became a place of connection. Voices carried across the water, men shouting news, sometimes sharing supplies, sometimes exchanging prisoners. These meetings were fleeting, for ships seldom sailed long together, but for a brief span they reminded the crews that they were not alone in their strange life. The greatest weight of these encounters was perhaps not the battle or plunder itself, but the long anticipation before it. For hours, sometimes days, men lived in the suspended state between monotony and violence, waiting for the horizon to reveal its secrets. This waiting shaped their character more than the fight itself, for it demanded patience, demanded the suppression of fear, demanded acceptance of the sea's slow pace. The rhythm of the waves continued, the groan of the timbers went on, but layered over it now was the tension of human expectation, the knowledge that life could change with a single decision. At night, if a sail was sighted in darkness, the watch grew heavier still, lanterns might be covered to hide their position. Voices hushed to avoid carrying across the water. Men strained to hear the sound of another ship's movement, the creak of foreign rigging, the faint boom of canvas catching wind. In such moments, the ocean felt less like a vast emptiness, and more like a narrow stage upon which invisible players moved, each waiting for the curtain to lift. And so, day after day, month after month, the life of pirates at sea was punctuated by these encounters. They were the sharp edges that cut through monotony, the moments when decisions of risk and gain pressed upon every man aboard. Most days ended with nothing more than fading sails upon the horizon, stories untold, lives untouched. But some days, a decision was made, and the course of the voyage shifted, for better or for worse. As dawn gave way to dusk, and as sails upon the horizon finally dipped below sight, the men returned to their places, the sound of the sea once more their companion. Yet the memory of the encounter lingered, shaping their dreams, their hopes, their fears. For in the endless waters, where each day resembled the last, it was these rare moments of sighting another ship that gave meaning to the passage of time, reminding them of the danger, the opportunity, and the fragile balance upon which their lives rested. And when the sun rose again, with the horizon still wide and empty, the ship returned to its ceaseless rhythm, the duties of day unfolding once more, accompanied by the constant but invisible presence of illness and injury, which touched pirate life as surely as hunger or battle. When the last traces of a distant sail had dipped beneath the horizon, and the crew dispersed from their posts, there was little left but to return to the familiar routines of the vessel itself. Above deck, the sea stretched endlessly in all directions, wind and wave, offering space and openness. But below deck, life narrowed into confinement. Here, beneath the planks of the main deck, was the world where pirates truly lived off duty, where the body rested, and where the human presence of the crew pressed most heavily against the wooden ribs of their floating home. The descent below deck was always a change in atmosphere. The bright glare of sun, the salt-streaked air, and the ceaseless sound of gulls or wind gave way to something dimmer, heavier, and altogether different. Light here came only from lanterns swinging gently with the roll of the ship, their faint glow casting shadows that seemed to sway like the timbers themselves. The air was thick, a mingling of tar from the ship's seams, the smoke of lamps, the salt of damp wood, and the sharp tang of sweat. In summer it was stifling, heat collecting in the enclosed space until breathing itself became labor, while in winter it grew damp and chill, the wood sweating with condensation, the cold seeping into bone. Hammocks lined the cramped quarters, strung from hooks set into beams, each man's bed little more than a canvas sling that swayed with the motion of the sea. Privacy was non-existent. Bodies slept shoulder to shoulder, the gentle rocking sometimes lulling exhausted men into uneasy slumber, at other times making rest impossible, when storms tossed the vessel and turned every hammock into a pendulum. The fabric was often damp, never quite drying, and after weeks aboard ship it carried the smell of salt and bodies that clung no matter how the men tried to ignore it. Rats were common companions in this shadowed world. They scurried between barrels, their claws scratching faintly against wood, feeding upon crumbs of hardtack or gnawing at sacks of grain. Some pirates caught them for sport, others killed them in irritation, but many simply let them be, for they were part of shipboard life and no more avoidable than the groan of the hull. Vermin reminded the crew of their reliance upon stores that decayed and dwindled with time. Rats were despised, yet in moments of desperation they were sometimes eaten, roasted over a small flame, their presence both curse and reluctant sustenance. The hold below deck also contained the supplies that sustained the voyage. Barrels of salted meat, hardtack biscuits and casks of water or grog were stacked tightly, lashed to prevent rolling when the sea grew rough. The smell of brine from the salted beef mixed with the must of grain sacks, creating an odor that permeated the air. Every meal that was drawn from these stores reminded men of the limits of their existence, for nothing here was fresh, and nothing came without the taste of preservation. Scurvy lurked in these rations, unseen but certain, the absence of fruits and vegetables gradually weakening gums and bodies. Space was always scarce. The pirate ship, like any vessel of its time, was built for function rather than comfort. The lower decks were not designed for tall men to stand upright, beams pressed low forcing most to stoop as they moved about. Passageways were narrow, allowing only one man at a time, and movement was always hindered by the need to step carefully around barrels, ropes and other supplies. For new recruits unaccustomed to the press of bodies and the confinement, the lack of space could be stifling, but for seasoned pirates it became simply the way of life, endured with the same patience as every other hardship at sea. Sleep was not restful in the way it might have been on land. The sounds of the sea, muted though they were below deck, still penetrated, the groan of timbers, the slap of waves, the whistle of wind. Added to these were the noises of the crew themselves, coughing, snoring, murmuring in restless dreams. Smoke from lanterns and pipes lingered in the air, stinging eyes and throats. For men recovering from wounds or illness, the below-deck quarters were both shelter and prison, a place where fevered bodies lay in hammocks, tended only by fellow crew who knew little of medicine beyond simple bandages and grog. Tar was another constant presence. It sealed the seams of the ship, keeping water from pouring in, but it also gave the air a pungent sharpness. Buckets of tar were kept at hand for repairs, and the smell permeated everything, clinging to clothing and hair. Mixed with the odor of salt, sweat and rot, it created a sensory world that no man could ever forget, even years after leaving the sea behind. It was the scent of confinement, the smell of existence below deck. Despite the hardships, this space was also where pirates created a semblance of home. Here they stored small possessions, a wooden carving, a coin kept for luck, a scrap of fabric from someone left behind. Some scratched initials or marks into beams, leaving behind their trace in wood that bore the weight of countless others before them. Men gathered in the dim light to whisper stories, to gamble when weather kept them from the open deck, to carve at bits of spare wood with knives, shaping trinkets in the glow of lanterns. The life below deck was harsh, but it was also where bonds were formed, where men learned to live not only beside one another, but upon one another, their lives pressed close in every sense. Disease and discomfort thrived in such conditions, with poor ventilation and dampness. Fevers spread quickly, and wounds festered more easily than they healed. Rats carried fleas, fleas carried sickness, and food sometimes spoiled before its time. The smells that rose from the lower deck carried this reality upward, mingling with the air above, a reminder to those on duty that life below was never far from decay. And yet, despite all this, the men returned here after each watch, after each encounter, after each day spent beneath the sun, because there was nowhere else to go. The life below deck was not a life of choice but of necessity, a world endured as part of the larger reality of piracy. In this dim and cramped space, men rested as best they could, prepared for another day when the deck above called them back to their duties. The ship was their prison and their freedom both, its upper deck giving them the sea, its lower spaces binding them together in confinement. To live here was to accept the mingling of discomfort, companionship, and inevitability, to endure the smells and the darkness as part of the bargain struck with the sea. And so, while the open horizon gave promise of plunder or escape, the world below remained the constant that shaped their days and nights. Here the pirate's life was most tangible, for it was in the close air, the swaying hammocks, and the ceaseless companionship of others that the reality of existence at sea pressed most heavily upon them. And from this darkened world, men would rise again to face the labor and uncertainty of the deck above, knowing that each day carried its own blend of hardship and hope, carried not only in sails and cannons, but in the very bodies of the men who bore them. From the dimness of the crew's quarters, one did not have to move far to find the heart of another essential space. The cook's galley, tucked into a cramped corner of the lower deck. This place was not grand by any measure, nor was it the kind of galley one might imagine in the tales of great ships of war or wealthy merchantmen. On a pirate vessel, it was small, often little more than a makeshift arrangement of fire and iron, a space claimed from necessity rather than comfort. Yet, despite its unassuming form, it was here that much of the crew's endurance was forged, for the galley provided the food and drink that kept men alive. The cook's galley was built around the caboose, a small shipboard stove fashioned of iron or brick, designed to contain a controlled flame within the wooden belly of a ship that was otherwise dangerously vulnerable to fire. A square chimney, no more than a narrow pipe, vented the smoke up through the deck and into the open air, though much of it still lingered below, mixing with the tar, sweat and lantern smoke that already choked the confined quarters. Around this stove were lashed the basic tools of the cook's trade: blackened kettles, battered pans, long-handled spoons, and hooks to hang provisions. The galley was no larger than a closet, its low beams and swaying floor making every movement precarious. Yet it was here that meals for dozens of men were prepared day after day. Salted beef, hardtack, and dried peas were the foundation of shipboard fare, and the cook transformed these staples into whatever variety he could manage. Salted beef was boiled for hours, its brine leaching into the water until it grew thick and greasy, the meat itself often riddled with gristle. Dried peas, soaked and boiled, became a thick soup that clung to wooden spoons, sometimes flavored with bits of pork fat, if such luxury could be spared. Hardtack, the ever-present ship's biscuit, was often so hard that it needed to be dunked into the stew or grog before teeth could manage it. The cook would sometimes pound the biscuits into crumbs, mixing them into broths to soften them, though this did little to disguise their stolenness or the weevils that frequently lived within them. Scarcity shaped every meal. Fresh food rarely lasted more than a week or two after a ship put to sea, and so the cook had little to work with beyond salted stores, and whatever could be caught or stolen. On rare days when a fishing line brought in a wriggling catch from the sea, the galley came alive with a sense of celebration. The fish would be gutted, salted lightly, and roasted over the fire, filling the lower deck with a different kind of scent. Fresher, less oppressive, a reminder of food as it once had been before the monotony of salted meat and biscuit. At times, sea turtles captured near tropical coasts found their way into the galley, their meat roasted or stewed, their shells sometimes kept as makeshift bowls or containers. Grog was another constant task for the cook. A mixture of water and rum, sometimes with lime juice or sugar if fortune allowed. Grog was not merely a drink of pleasure, but a necessity. Fresh water stored in casks grew stale quickly, turning green with algae, sometimes slimy with growth. Mixing it with rum masked the taste, and killed some of the contamination. The cook ladled grog into cups or wooden mugs, its sharpness burning throats yet lifting spirits, its presence ensuring that men drank enough liquid to stave off the worst effects of dehydration. Pirates, unlike many naval crews, often had better access to rum, for plundered stores from captured ships were shared out generously, and so grog was a familiar companion to nearly every meal. The cook himself was often a figure both respected and ridiculed. His role was vital, for without his labor the crew could not function, but he worked in conditions few envied. Smoke stung his eyes constantly, the cramped galley left him bent over for hours, and the heat of the small stove pressed against him, even as the ship rocked beneath his feet. Burns were common, as were cuts from knives dulled by salt and use. Yet he bore responsibility not only for filling stomachs, but for keeping sickness at bay, for spoiled meat or contaminated food could sicken an entire crew. A cook who managed to stretch meager supplies into something resembling variety was valued, for even the smallest change in diet lifted morale. Improvisation was the cook's greatest skill. From time to time, captured stores from other ships brought spices, sugar, flour, or dried fruits into the galley, and then meals became something more than endurance. A stew flavored with pepper or cloves felt almost luxurious, reminding men of ports left far behind. A pudding of flour, fat, and dried fruit boiled in a cloth bag became a celebration on feast days, no matter how heavy or bland it might have seemed on land. Even coffee or cocoa, seized from merchantmen, could find its way into the cups of pirates, lending an energy that was rare at sea. But most days were ordinary, filled with the routine of boiling salted meat, ladling out pea soup, and breaking hardtack into manageable pieces. The smell of the galley spread throughout the ship, a mix of brine, smoke, and grease, a scent that clung to clothing and hair as surely as the tar and sweat of labor. Men came to know the timing of meals not by clocks but by the rhythm of the cook's labors, the rising steam, the rattle of pots, and the faint call when it was time to collect rations. Meals were eaten wherever men could find space, often on deck when weather permitted, or in the dimness below when storms forced them inside. Wooden bowls and spoons were passed along, mugs dipped into shared casks of grog. There was little ceremony, little sense of dining as it might be known on land, but for men who lived in constant motion, food was fuel, taken quickly and returned to duty or rest. Yet even here, in the simplest act of eating, bonds were strengthened, for the sharing of hardship created a unity that was as essential as sails and ropes. In this way, the cook's galley stood as a strange paradox. Cramped, smoky, and unpleasant to work in, it was nonetheless the place where survival was made possible. Every pirate depended on it. Every man shaped his days around the rhythm of its offerings, and every voyage was measured by the stores that flowed from its barrels. The cook, often overlooked in stories of plunder and adventure, was in truth one of the most vital figures aboard ship, for without him, no crew could endure the endless horizon or the long weeks between ports. And so, while the galley was small and its offerings plain, it was the beating heart of the ship's daily life, binding men together through the shared act of eating and drinking, carrying them forward through hunger, hardship, and hope alike. It was here, in the mingling of salt, smoke, and steam, that the endurance of piracy was forged each day anew. Yet even as the galley offered warmth, food, and grog, its smoky air and the unvaried provisions that flowed from it carried with them a shadow that no crew could ever ignore: the slow, creeping weight of sickness. For aboard a pirate ship, illness and injury were constant companions, as real and present as the rolling sea itself. The confined quarters, the salty diet stripped of freshness, and the hazards of life upon a wooden vessel made health a fragile and fleeting condition, easily broken and seldom restored with ease. One of the most feared afflictions at sea was scurvy, the slow deterioration of the body, brought about by a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. It did not arrive suddenly, but rather crept into the lives of sailors over weeks and months, its first signs small and easily dismissed: a weariness that no rest relieved, a soreness in the gums, a stiffness in the limbs. Soon, however, the symptoms grew more dreadful. Gums swelled and bled, teeth loosened and fell, old wounds reopened as though the body had forgotten how to heal, skin grew blotched, breath turned foul, and the very strength that kept a man upright drained away until he lay helpless in his hammock. Among pirates, as with all seafarers of the age, scurvy was not a mystery but an inevitability, a condition endured with grim resignation, unless fortune brought them into contact with citrus fruits from captured ships or coastal raids. A single barrel of limes, seized from a merchantman, could breathe life into a crew otherwise wasting away, the sour juice a miracle in its simplicity. Other illnesses stalked the ship as well. Dysentery, born of tainted water and spoiled food, spread quickly in the cramped spaces below deck. Men doubled over with cramps, their bodies weakened by the constant flux, and in the darkness of the hold there was little that could be done but endure. Fevers too were common, some carried from distant ports where tropical diseases lingered in stagnant waters. Malaria and yellow fever might strike men weeks after leaving warm coasts, the symptoms erupting suddenly in shivers and sweats, the skin burning one day and chilled the next. Infections of the skin too were frequent: boils, rashes, and ulcers caused by poor hygiene and constant dampness, the body chafed by salt sweat, and the rough fibers of clothing that was seldom washed. Injury was no less constant than illness. Life aboard ship was a ceaseless hazard, even without the presence of battle. The rigging, high and treacherous, claimed men with sudden falls. A missed step, a rope slipping in wet hands, or a gust of wind could send a sailor tumbling to the deck or into the sea, where few could be saved. Heavy blocks and barrels swung with the roll of the ship, crushing limbs or striking skulls. The simple act of hauling ropes and sails strained muscles, tore skin, and left hands raw. Burns came easily in the galley, and cuts from knives and tools became dangerous when infection set in, the flesh swelling and reddening until fever spread. When battle came, wounds multiplied swiftly. Cutlass blades left gashes, pistols fired lead into flesh, splinters from shattered timbers tore through skin with deadly force. The thunder of cannon left men not only deafened but maimed, their limbs shattered by iron shot. Blood pooled on deck in such moments, the smell of iron and powder mixing with salt spray, and the cries of the wounded carried far into the rigging. Yet battle was not always required for injury, for even small disputes among crew could lead to cuts and bruises, for pirates were men living hard lives, their tempers quickened by rum and hardship. Medical care was rudimentary at best. Few ships carried a trained surgeon, and those that did were rare prizes indeed. More often, a man with some knowledge, perhaps gained as a barber, a butcher, or an assistant on a naval ship, served as the healer. His tools were crude: knives, saws, needles and thread, kept in a chest along with bandages torn from old cloth. Wounds were cleaned with rum or seawater, stitched roughly with coarse thread, the patient biting on leather or wood to endure the pain. Amputation was sometimes the only remedy for shattered limbs, the saw cutting swiftly while shipmates held the writhing body down. Infection was nearly inevitable, and many a man who survived the blade succumbed days later to fever and rot. For fevers and fluxes there was little to offer but rest and hope. Herbal remedies, gathered in ports or from captured ships, were sometimes tried. Dried leaves steeped in hot water, powders mixed with grog, but their effectiveness was uncertain. Superstition also played its part, for in the absence of knowledge, charms and rituals offered comfort, if not cure. Some pirates believed that certain herbs could drive away sickness, others that wearing particular trinkets warded off death. Prayer was not uncommon, even among men who lived lawless lives, for in moments of weakness the thought of divine mercy was often a final resort. Despite the bleakness of medicine, the crew often rallied around the ill and injured, for survival at sea demanded a measure of brotherhood. Hammocks were adjusted to keep the sick more comfortable. Food was softened for those who could not chew. Grog was offered in greater measure to dull pain. When death came, as it often did, the body was sewn into canvas, weighted with shot, and committed to the sea with simple solemnity. No matter how rough their lives, pirates recognized the shared fate of all who sailed, and the burial at sea was both a farewell and a reminder of their own fragile mortality. The presence of sickness and injury shaped the rhythm of life aboard ship. It made every barrel of fresh fruit a treasure, every clean swallow of water a relief, every day survived a victory. It gave weight to the role of the cook, whose food could preserve or weaken health, and to the rare surgeon whose hands decided between life and death. It lent urgency to the hunt for ships, for supplies of medicine and fresh provisions were as valuable as gold, and it reminded every man that beneath the bravado and the tales of freedom, piracy was a life balanced precariously against forces that could not be fought with cutlass or cannon. Thus, in the smoky galley and the dim hammocks below, in the cries of the wounded and the groans of the sick, the truth of pirate life was laid bare. It was not only storms and battles that tested their endurance, but the frailty of the human body, ever vulnerable, ever at risk, in a world where the sea gave little mercy. And as one man weakened, others knew that their turn might come, for illness and injury spared no one for long, and the creaking timbers of the ship carried their suffering into every corner of its narrow world. Though illness and injury gnawed quietly at the edges of daily existence, another shadow stretched across the deck, more immediate and more feared by the crew: the threat of punishment. For all the tales of freedom and rebellion that filled the lore of piracy, the reality was that such a life could not survive without discipline. A ship adrift without order was doomed, its men torn apart by quarrels and greed, its voyage cut short by neglect. To prevent this, pirates created codes, and within those codes lay punishments, grim reminders that liberty at sea came only with boundaries. The pirate code varied from crew to crew, often written down in articles and agreed upon by oath before a voyage began. These articles covered everything from the division of plunder to the care of weapons, from the duty to fight in battle to the prohibition of theft among shipmates. Each man signed or marked his agreement, and once bound by these rules, he accepted both the privileges and the penalties. And the penalties, though rarely applied without cause, were harsh enough to remind every pirate that freedom had limits, even aboard a vessel that defied kings and navies. Flogging was one of the most common punishments. A man caught stealing from a comrade, shirking duty, or breaking the code could be tied to the mast and lashed with a rope's end or a whip. The strokes left welts across the back, sometimes drawing blood, always leaving pain as a reminder. The crew often watched in silence, the lesson not only for the one punished but for all who might be tempted to stray. Though brutal, flogging was seen as corrective, a means of preserving discipline without destroying the offender entirely. The man would heal, and in healing, be folded back into the life of the ship. Yet for more serious offences, sterner measures awaited. Marooning was one such fate, dreaded above nearly all others. To maroon a man was to abandon him on a barren island or coast, with little more than a jug of water, a pistol, and perhaps some powder. There he would face the slow agony of hunger, thirst, and solitude, the sea lapping endlessly at the shore, while no ship came to rescue him. It was a punishment reserved for betrayal, mutiny, or crimes that severed the bonds of trust too deeply to mend. The marooned man might live for days or weeks, but the end was nearly always the same, his bones left to bleach beneath the sun. Execution too had its place in pirate justice, though it was not always swift or merciful. A mutineer might be hanged from the yardarm, his body swaying above the deck as a stark symbol of the cost of rebellion. A murderer might face a pistol shot, the captain or a chosen comrade delivering the sentence. In rare but terrible cases, a man could be keel-hauled, dragged beneath the hull of the ship, scraped by barnacles, and drowned if fortune did not favour him. Such punishments were not dealt lightly, for pirates, unlike naval officers, relied on the consent of their crew. Harshness that seemed unjust could turn the men against their leaders, but when punishment was demanded by the code and upheld by common agreement, it carried the weight of collective will. The threat of discipline extended beyond physical punishment into the very fabric of daily life. A man who failed to keep his weapon clean, for example, risked fines or loss of his share of loot, for a rusted cutlass or an unprimed pistol endangered the entire crew in battle. Those who gambled and failed to pay their debts could be stripped of privileges or assigned the hardest labor. Cowardice in the face of the enemy might bring disgrace, while desertion, if discovered, was treated as betrayal. In every case, the punishments reinforced the code's central truth, that the survival of the many depended on the conduct of each. What made pirate justice distinctive was not only its severity, but also its foundation in democracy. Unlike the harsh command of naval captains, who ruled with unquestioned authority, pirate punishments were often decided by vote. The captain and quartermaster held sway, but the crew had their voices, and no man was punished without the consent of his fellows. This gave the system a strange fairness, for each pirate knew that he himself had agreed to the articles, and that his peers would one day sit in judgment if he faltered. The punishments were cruel, but they were not arbitrary, and in this balance of severity and consent lay the fragile cohesion of pirate life. The atmosphere of discipline shaped the rhythm of the ship. It bred caution in dealings among shipmates, for theft or violence carried heavy risks. It ensured that weapons were maintained, that watches were kept, that food and drink were not hoarded. It gave weight to the authority of the captain, not as a tyrant, but as a leader upheld by the law they all shared. And it reminded every man that though he had fled the rigid order of navy or kingdom, he had not escaped rules altogether. Even in rebellion, order was needed, for the sea punished disorder more harshly than any whip. In this way, the pirate ship lived in a strange paradox. It was at once a place of freedom and of law, of equality and of fear. The laughter of dice games and the songs of shanties were balanced by the silence of punishments carried out, the creak of the rope, the sting of the lash, the lonely outline of a marooned figure left behind on a distant shore. Discipline was the price of survival, and every man paid it, whether in obedience, in pain, or in rare and grim cases, with his life. For hours, sometimes days, storms raged. Food could not be cooked, rest could not be found. Hammocks swung wildly below deck, men too soaked and weary to sleep, even when given leave. The smell of wet tar and seawater filled every corner, and the air grew heavy with the damp of clothing that never dried. Salt stung eyes, skin blistered with exposure, and hands cracked from endless rope work. The discipline enforced by flogging and code was replaced by the harsher discipline of nature, and all bent under its lash equally, captain and crew alike. And yet, storms did not always bring ruin. Often, after days of noise and violence, the wind slackened, the rain eased, and slowly the sea calmed. The crew emerged from exhaustion to survey damage. Torn rigging, split spars, sails shredded, barrels lost, food spoiled. They counted the men who remained, mourned those washed away, and then began the slow work of repair. For even after the storm had ended, its weight lingered, and the ship was seldom whole without days of labor. Still, the relief of survival gave them strength, and as the sun returned, men stood upon the deck, gazing out at waters once more calm, and felt a grim pride. They had not mastered the sea, no one did, but they had endured, and endurance was all that was asked. Storms were remembered not in tales of victory, but in scars, both upon the ship and upon the men themselves. Rope burns upon hands, twisted joints from falls, fevers born of soaking cold, these were their mementos. The ship, too, bore its marks. Patched sails, new timbers replacing shattered ones, lines reknotted where old ones had snapped. To sail on was to carry the memory of every storm endured, the past storms whispering warnings of those yet to come. And in the quiet that followed, when the sun set upon a calmed sea, men sat in silence, too weary for song, too tired for dice. The creak of the timbers and the hush of the waves seemed softer then, almost merciful, as if the sea, having shown its strength, now allowed them brief peace. Yet they knew, as every sailor did, that another storm would one day rise, for the ocean's moods were endless, and pirates, like all who sailed, lived always in its shadow. And so, when the last repairs were made, and sails filled once more with steady wind, the ship continued on, carrying men who had survived both their own discipline and the sea's harsh judgment, men whose next concern was not only weather, but the possibility of landfall, where strange coasts and foreign ports offered both temptation and peril. When storms had passed, and the sea returned to its patient rhythm, when men's hands were again steady enough for dice, and their voices strong enough for song, thoughts often drifted toward the subject that bound them together as much as any code, the matter of treasure. For all the hardship endured, all the risk of storm and battle, the pursuit of loot was the defining thread of their lives. Yet what pirates sought, and what they truly valued, was not always the gleaming gold and overflowing chests of legend, but a more practical collection of goods that sustained their voyage and made the endless sea bearable. The spoils of piracy came rarely in the form of mythical treasure maps or great islands of buried wealth. Instead, they arrived when another vessel was overtaken, when its cargo became theirs to divide. Merchantmen were common prey, carrying not royal treasure, but trade goods, barrels of flour and salted fish, casks of wine and rum, bolts of cloth, crates of tools, and sometimes livestock bound for colonial ports. These things, though mundane, were worth as much as silver to men who lived without certainty of tomorrow's meal. A captured cargo of lemons or oranges might save them from the creeping wounds of scurvy. A few barrels of clean water were often more precious than coins. Even medicine, rare as it was, carried a value beyond measure. Gold and silver, when they did appear, were certainly welcomed. Spanish ships especially carried coins, minted in the colonies, and jewels taken from the Americas or Asia, sometimes passed through vulnerable hands. But such riches were less common, and pirates who relied on them alone soon starved. More often, they seized rum and brandy. The barrels rolled across the deck, and broached before the prize ship had even vanished beyond the horizon. Tobacco, too, became currency of a kind, smoked in stolen pipes, its acrid scent rising above the sea air. Cloth meant clothing patched and replaced, while iron nails and spare rope meant survival, for repairs were constant and materials hard to come by on the open ocean. The act of dividing loot followed rules as binding as any law on land, and it was in this matter that pirate democracy revealed its clearest expression. Before voyages began, articles were signed, codes of conduct that dictated not only discipline and behavior, but also the shares each man would receive. The captain might take a larger portion, perhaps 2 shares, while the quartermaster took 1.5, and ordinary crew received 1. Those who risked more, such as men handling powder in battle, or surgeons working through blood and pain, might be granted extra. Even those injured in service were compensated. The articles promising fixed payments for lost limbs or blinded eyes, recognizing in their way that fairness was essential if men were to remain willing to fight. When a prize was taken, the quartermaster oversaw the distribution. Goods were piled upon the deck, tallied, and sometimes auctioned among the crew if personal items were in question. Clothing, weapons, or small trinkets might be claimed by one man or another, the price bid from shares of coin. The larger bulk, food, drink, tools, was stored in the hold, becoming common supply for the voyage. Coin and precious metals were weighed and counted, divided according to the articles. The act was not swift, nor filled with celebration, but a careful process, for quarrels over division could end friendships and cause mutiny. And so, men stood in watchful silence, the sound of waves mingling with the clink of coin, as their portion was measured. Yet the meaning of treasure stretched beyond the physical. For men who had once been pressed sailors in navy ships, beaten and starved under the command of officers, who enriched themselves while their crew went unpaid, the equal division of spoils was itself a kind of treasure. Here aboard the creaking deck of a pirate ship, a man's work was rewarded not with scraps, but with fair shares. He could hold in his hands coins that were his by right, not withheld by distant admirals or corrupt pursers. This sense of equality, of justice denied on naval decks, gave the weight of silver an almost symbolic glow, and when loot was plentiful, the ship changed. Spirits lifted, dice rolled more freely, songs rose louder at night. A man who had gone months with nothing but tattered clothing might purchase new boots at the next port, or trade his share of coin for a knife that fit his hand more comfortably. Rum was drunk in greater quantities, though always with the risk of quarrels and brawls that followed. Some men dreamed of saving their share, enough to one day leave the sea, buy land, or vanish into a port town with enough coin to live quietly. Few succeeded, but the dream lingered, as enduring as the horizon itself. The legend of treasure, however, was never absent. Sailors spoke of great hoards buried on lonely islands, of captains who hid their wealth in caves or beneath sands, leaving maps marked with symbols and riddles. Most of these were fancies, tales spun to pass the hours, yet they persisted because the idea of permanent wealth offered contrast to the fleeting nature of coin in hand. For in truth, much of what was taken was quickly spent, gambled in taverns, lost in brothels, traded for drink, squandered in days ashore, until men found themselves once more penniless and ready to sail again. The sea took as quickly as it gave, and permanence was a rare gift in a pirate's life. The physical treasure, then, was less important than the rhythm it created. To capture and divide was to renew the voyage, to remind the men of why they endured storm and hunger. Each share was a bond reaffirmed, each coin a symbol of their collective strength. And even when shares were small, even when a voyage yielded only food and water, it was still treasure of a kind, for it kept them alive upon an ocean that offered nothing freely. And so, after each division, the coins were stowed, the goods stored, the ship made ready again. Men returned to their hammocks or their duties, their pockets a little heavier, their hopes a little higher. The next morning, they would wake once more to creaking timbers and endless waves, their eyes searching the horizon for another sail, another chance at fortune. For treasure, whether coin, food, or mere survival, was always somewhere ahead, and it was this pursuit that carried them forward as surely as wind in their sails. And with thoughts of wealth fresh in their minds, and the knowledge that survival and plunder were bound together, their eyes turned not only to treasure, but also to the ports and coasts where such goods might be traded, spent or lost, for life ashore carried its own temptations and dangers. After the clatter of coins had faded, after barrels were stowed, and the murmurs of men drifted into quiet satisfaction, the sea itself often reminded them that treasure was fleeting, and that fortune on the water could shift to silence with no warning at all. There were times when days turned into weeks without the sight of another ship, when the wind, once a companion that drove them toward opportunity, fell away and left them adrift upon a motionless plain of water. These periods, known to all sailors, but dreaded especially by pirates who thrived on movement and chance, were the long calms. In a calm, the sea ceased its familiar rhythm. The waves no longer broke with their rolling voice, but smoothed into a glassy expanse that stretched unbroken in every direction. The sails, once full-bellied with wind, sagged like weary cloth, limp against the masts. The rigging, which usually hummed and creaked, fell silent, and the ship itself seemed to rest, drifting lazily, moved only by faint currents beneath the surface. The heat became unbearable, for the sun beat down without mercy, and without wind there was no relief. The deck grew hot beneath bare feet, the air thick and unmoving. For the crew, these days dragged like heavy chains. Work, already repetitive, grew harder without the cooling push of breeze. Scrubbing the deck meant sweating under a relentless sun, tar clinging and itching on skin. Climbing the rigging, usually a place of air and movement, became a still perch in a suffocating sky, and when the tasks were done there was nothing but waiting. Long hours stretched with no promise of change. The horizon remained empty, no sails to pursue, no land in sight. The sea became an endless mirror, and men found themselves staring into it with a mixture of boredom and dread. Food and drink lost their comfort during such times. Water, already rationed, grew warm and stale in its casks. Hardtack crumbled dry in the mouth, clinging to teeth, offering no pleasure beyond filling the belly. Salted meat seemed saltier still when the body craved freshness. Even rum, a comfort in ordinary evenings, dulled the senses more than it enlivened them, and drunkenness often led to quarrels under the oppressive sun. Dice rolled lazily, songs faltered without wind to carry them, and carving or mending became mechanical gestures rather than true distractions. It was in the calm that tempers grew short. Men who could laugh at storms or face battle with steady hands grew restless when forced to wait. The lack of progress felt like a kind of imprisonment, the ocean holding them captive without chains. Small disputes over food, over hammocks, over the use of tools could flare into anger, requiring the firm hand of quartermasters and captains to keep order. The code of conduct, so vital in distribution of loot, became equally important in the still days, for without it, quarrels might turn to fights that threatened the fragile unity on which their survival depended. Disease also found its place during calms. With no new provisions and no fresh supplies, scurvy tightened its grip. Gums swelled and bled, teeth loosened, limbs weakened. Men lay in hammocks with fever or sores, while the healthy struggled to remain patient. Rats, always present below deck, seemed bolder in still air, scurrying across hammocks or gnawing at stores. The stench of the hold grew thicker without the circulation of wind, and men sometimes took to sleeping on deck simply to escape the suffocation below. Pirates did not sail boldly into the grand harbors of the world. They sought hidden places, where the authorities had no presence, or where local sympathies leaned toward secrecy and trade rather than law and order. Coves tucked behind jagged cliffs, islands shielded by reefs, or remote stretches of coastline became their havens. Approaching such places was a careful process, for the same rocks and shallows that offered concealment could also splinter a ship that drew too close without caution. Experienced hands guided the vessel inward, eyes sharp for the shift in color that signaled shallow waters, ropes ready to let anchors fall when the ship had reached a safe point. The act of docking, though less dramatic than boarding a prize or braving a storm, was one of the most delicate maneuvers of all. The sails were trimmed, the speed of the ship slowed to a crawl, and the anchor was released with a heavy plunge into the water. The creak of timbers and the strain of rope followed, the ship shuddering faintly as it settled into its resting place. There was a quiet relief in that moment, the knowledge that the ceaseless motion of the sea would pause, at least for a time. Men who had grown used to swaying decks felt the difference immediately, their steps adjusting to the steadiness beneath them. Once anchored, the ship became a hive of activity. Tasks that had been postponed at sea now demanded attention. The sails, stiff with salt and wear, were lowered and patched where the wind had torn them. Ropes frayed by strain were replaced with fresh cordage acquired in trade or brought from earlier raids. The hull was inspected for damage, and tar heated once more to seal any leaks that had developed. At times, the ship would be deliberately beached, its belly exposed to the air so that barnacles and seaweed could be scraped away. Such work was laborious, but without it, the vessel could not hope to endure another journey. As repairs were made, the matter of spoils was also addressed. Contrary to the romantic images of chests overflowing with gold, the division of loot was often a practical affair. Goods were laid out, bolts of cloth, barrels of rum, crates of tobacco, sacks of grain, tools, weapons and coins of many nations mingled together. Each man received his share according to the articles of agreement drawn up when they had first set out. The captain took no king's portion, only the part agreed upon by the crew. Injuries sustained at sea were accounted for, with compensation offered in recognition of lost limbs or diminished ability. The fairness of this division was part of what bound pirates together, distinguishing their life from that aboard naval or merchant ships, where officers grew rich and common sailors were often left with nothing. These moments of division were not only practical but symbolic. They reminded the crew of the purpose of their hardships, the hunger endured, the storms weathered, the risks taken in battle. A handful of silver coins, a few bolts of cloth, or a ration of rum might not seem a king's fortune, yet for men who had abandoned the rigid hierarchies of the world ashore, it represented freedom, independence, and the fruit of shared endeavor. The goods not claimed by individuals were bartered in hidden markets, exchanged with local traders who asked no questions or stockpiled for the voyages yet to come. With provisions replenished, repairs completed, and men rested, there was a brief interlude of relative ease. Pirates might set foot on land, walking upon steady ground for the first time in months, filling their lungs with the scent of earth and vegetation. Some sought the company of taverns, while others preferred the solitude of quiet beaches, letting the waves lap at their feet without the constant sway of the deck beneath them. The land offered respite, yet it was never more than a pause, for pirates were bound by their nature to return to the sea. For all the labor of dividing spoils and repairing ships, the cycle always drew them back to the horizon. A pirate's life was not defined by arrival, but by continual departure. The end of one voyage marked the preparation for the next. The sails, once patched, were raised again. The anchor, heavy and dependable, was hauled back to the deck. The crew, their pockets a little fuller, and their bodies somewhat rested, returned to their stations. The coastline slipped once more into the distance, and the sea reclaimed them with its vast expanse. Thus the rhythm of their existence continued. The long days of labor, the stillness of the calms, the violence of storms, the moments of fortune and the stretches of want, all bound together in an endless pattern. Each voyage was unique in its details, yet all shared the same arc: departure, endurance, arrival, and departure again. This was the true life of a pirate, not merely the pursuit of treasure, but the acceptance of a cycle that began anew each time they set sail upon the restless waters. And so, as one voyage ended in the quiet shelter of a hidden port, another always loomed just beyond the horizon, waiting with its promises and its perils, ensuring that the daily life of a pirate at sea was never truly finished, only paused before the call of the ocean drew them forth again. Landfall meant more than variety in the scenery. For men who had endured hardtack and salted meat, whose lips cracked from brine and whose bodies weakened from stale air, it promised water fresh from streams and springs, fruits that grew in abundance, and meat not yet shriveled in salt. It offered wood to mend their vessels, herbs to fight scurvy, and sometimes the chance of trade or plunder, if settlements were near. Yet, as much as it was a relief, approaching land carried its own dangers. Pirates rarely came openly to shore. Naval patrols, colonial governors, and local militias were always wary of ships that lingered too close, for pirates were both feared and despised by most authorities. To approach carelessly was to risk cannon fire from a fort, a sudden trap, or a blockade that cut off escape. Instead, captains ordered the sails adjusted to bring them into quiet coves, narrow bays, or hidden inlets where the ship might anchor unseen. Knowledge of such hiding places was as valuable as treasure itself, passed among seafarers, or found through long experience. Small islands with fresh springs, mangroves where a ship could be concealed, or deserted beaches where barrels could be filled. These were marked not on official charts, but in the memory of those who sailed under the black flag. The sight of a cove brought a stir of movement across the deck. Men lowered longboats, rowed to shore with casks to fill from streams, and returned with their precious cargo. Others ventured inland to cut firewood or gather fruit, often returning with coconuts, citrus or bananas in tropical waters, or apples and berries in temperate lands. Sometimes, pigs or goats were hunted, their meat roasted that very evening, filling the air with a smell that broke the monotony of salted provisions. For a time life regained a flavor forgotten at sea, but land brought more than sustenance. It brought risk of discovery. Smoke from a fire could give away their presence. Tracks left by boots in sand could be noticed by scouts. Even the ship itself, if not well hidden, might be spotted by another vessel. For this reason, pirates moved quickly, their landings efficient, their tasks divided as carefully as when preparing for a raid. Men were sent to watch the coast while others worked inland. Fires were kept small, and nights ashore were rare, unless the place was truly deserted. The ship remained their true refuge, the land a temporary reprieve rather than a home. Still, for men long confined to cramped quarters, the feel of earth beneath their feet was a pleasure beyond measure. To walk without the deck swaying beneath them, to lie upon grass or sand instead of canvas hammocks, to drink from a stream cold and running instead of dipping a ladle into stagnant casks. These were luxuries as real as gold. Some men wandered farther, if allowed, exploring with a cautious curiosity, their minds recalling the last time they had touched solid ground. Approaching land was also a time of quiet vigilance. Pirates knew that not all who lived ashore were enemies, but few could be trusted. Islanders might trade willingly for tools, cloth or rum, but they might also inform naval ships of their presence. Settlers might provide supplies, yet they might also raise a militia to defend their homes. And always, there was the knowledge that other pirates sometimes claimed the same hiding places, and rival crews could turn a cove into a trap. Thus, landfall was never a moment of complete relaxation. It was instead a balancing act, between relief and risk, between survival and secrecy. Captains reminded their men that caution was as important here as in battle, that a careless word or a reckless action ashore could cost them their freedom or their lives. And so they moved with restraint, never lingering longer than necessary, never taking more than the land could provide without notice. When the ship's casks were full, when fruit hung heavy in their nets, when wood was stacked and meat salted, the boats returned once more, laden with supplies. The anchor was weighed, sails unfurled, and slowly the ship drew away from the hidden cove. The coastline faded behind them, a promise of plenty left for another time, a memory to sustain them through the long weeks of sea to come. For pirates, the land was never home. It was a momentary relief, a place to draw breath before returning to the vast expanse where their lives truly unfolded. Yet each approach carried the same feeling, a reminder that beyond the endless horizon there was always the touch of earth, the flow of rivers, the shade of trees, waiting to remind them that the sea, for all its hold on their lives, was not the only world that existed. And as the coastline dwindled behind the stern, as the sails caught fresh winds and the creak of timbers rose once more in rhythm, the men turned their eyes not only back to the sea, but ahead to the thought of what lay beyond. For sooner or later, the time would come when their voyages ended, not in coves or hidden bays, but in the final return that awaited all men of the sea. When the coastlines had faded into shadow, and the sails once again drew them out into the open reaches of the ocean, the rhythm of life shifted quietly into night. The sun's glare, the pressing weight of midday heat, and the clamorous stir of labor on deck gave way to stillness, broken only by the appointed calls of the watch. Nights at sea were never wholly silent, for the ship itself never ceased to move, its timbers straining and sighing, its ropes groaning as the wind tugged at canvas, but the atmosphere was hushed compared to the clamorous hours of daylight. The ship became a dim shape adrift upon an endless expanse, its lanterns glowing faintly, casting just enough light to mark the railings, the hatchways, and the steps that kept men from stumbling as they kept their posts. The night watchers divided the crew into their duties, just as in daylight, though fewer men were needed when sails had already been set and course established. Those chosen for the first watch would pace slowly along the deck, eyes scanning the horizon and ears attuned for sounds that carried across the water, the snap of another ship's sail, the muffled beat of distant drums from a settlement, or more often, nothing at all but the unbroken hush of waves sliding past the hull. A lookout at the bow leaned over the rail, peering into the darkness, where the sea met the sky, and another, aloft in the rigging, swayed with the mast as he scanned for any faint glimmer that might betray another vessel in the distance. These men did not expect much, for most nights passed uneventfully, yet the habit of vigilance was ingrained. Surprise was the enemy, and night was its ally. Above them, the sky unfolded with a grandeur, unlike anything seen ashore. Far from city fires or lanterns, the stars stretched in vast constellations, their patterns studied and remembered by those who used them for navigation. The North Star, fixed and unwavering, served as a guide when compass needles quivered or maps grew uncertain. Sailors traced the arc of Orion's belt, the sweep of the Milky Way, the rising and setting of stars that told them the passage of hours. On clear nights, the moon cast a pale road across the water, a shimmering path that seemed to point endlessly ahead, though it offered no true destination. Clouds could obscure the heavens, leaving the ship adrift in a darkness so complete that only the faint glow of the lantern and the occasional flash of phosphorescence in the wake gave shape to the night. For those not on watch, night meant rest, though rest on a pirate ship was never wholly peaceful. Below deck, hammocks swayed with the motion of the sea, their ropes creaking faintly in the dark. Men lay with knives close at hand, their sleep broken by snores, coughs, or the scuttling of rats across the planks. Some drifted easily, accustomed to the rocking that had become as natural as breathing. Others stirred often, waking to the memory of storms, raids, or punishments seen in the day. The air below was close, thick with the mingled smells of salt, tar, smoke, and sweat. But after long weeks afloat, it was accepted as part of life, no more remarked upon than the creak of the mast above. The deck itself, under starlight, held a quiet that was almost meditative. A man at the helm stood steady, hands on the wheel, eyes flicking between compass and horizon, guiding the vessel by habit as much as by sight. The sails filled or slackened with the changing winds, and the sound of water slapping against the hull became the heartbeat of the night. Sometimes, dolphins leapt beside the ship, their bodies catching the moonlight before vanishing into the dark sea again. At other times, schools of fish stirred the surface, their scales glittering faintly before they disappeared back into the depths. There were nights when the sea lay calm, its surface smooth as glass, the ship moving as though upon a mirror. In such stillness, voices carried farther, and the faintest murmur could be heard across the deck. The crew, however, rarely spoke much during their watch, their words confined to brief exchanges about the course, the sails, or a reminder to keep eyes open. On other nights, winds rose sharply, and though no storm pressed down, the ship strained under gusts that snapped canvas and rattled rigging. Then the watchman moved more swiftly, adjusting lines and checking knots, keeping the vessel steady until the gusts passed. Nights were also the time when men, freed from daylight labor, felt the weight of distance most keenly. Though pirates had abandoned homes, families, and lives ashore, many still thought of them in the quiet hours, staring at the stars that had looked down on every coast they had known. Some fingered small tokens, a ring, a scrap of cloth, a carving, before sleep claimed them. Others found solace in routine, pacing the deck, and focusing only on the sound of the sea. The vastness of the ocean was most apparent in the dark, when no shore could be seen, and no other ship broke the horizon. It reminded them that they lived at the mercy of elements far beyond their control. Night, too, was when discipline revealed itself in subtle ways, the order of watches, the rotation of men, the careful record of the ship's course marked in the log. All these continued even when most of the crew slept. The sense of law and rhythm that had been shaped during the day persisted in the hours of darkness, as though the ship itself demanded constancy. Pirates may have rejected the kings and parliaments of the land, but they could not reject the demands of the sea, which allowed no lapse in attention. As the hours wore on, stars shifted in the sky, and the weary men of the first watch were replaced by others, shaking off sleep to take their turn. The sea showed little difference from one hour to the next, but the rotation marked the slow passage of time, until the faintest paling of the sky in the east hinted that morning would come again. The ship remained adrift between sea and sky, its crew suspended between wakefulness and slumber, between vigilance and weariness, in the long hours that defined nights at sea. And when at last the horizon softened, and the first trace of dawn began to stir, the cycle repeated, the ship awakening once more to the creak of timbers, the cry of seabirds, and the labors that never ceased for men who lived their lives afloat upon a shifting, endless world. All when the long weeks at sea finally drew toward their close, There was no sudden outburst of celebration, no cheering that echoed over the waves. The end of a voyage came gradually, with small signs that the men had come to recognize over countless journeys. It might be the distant outline of a headland on the horizon, the faint smell of earth carried on the breeze, or the sudden shift in the cries of seabirds, growing louder and more insistent as land drew near. These were the subtle signals that the ocean, for all its vast indifference, was yielding once more to the nearness of shore.